The committee will hear directly from the department's highest-ranking official, Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. I thank the Secretary for appearing here today. We've worked hard to find this day on your calendar, avoiding pandemics and every other challenge that they were thrown at us. I'm glad you're with us today. Secretary Mayorkas inherited a department that was really in chaos. Under President Trump, DHS lurched from one secretary or acting secretary to the next, 6 in total, only 2 of whom were Senate confirmed. Don't take it from me. Listen to every Senate confirmed DHS secretary prior to the Trump administration, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. They jointly wrote in January of this year, and I quote, "This has amounted to, on average, a new secretary in this department every 9.5 months to manage the turbulent challenges of large-scale cyber attacks, border security, violent white nationalism, wildfires in the West, staff shakeups and firings, the gross politicization of the agency's mission, and rulings from the Government Accountability Office, and at least 1 court that the most recent former acting secretary was serving illegally." I might remind you, those were comments by the 4 previous secretaries of DHS, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. They added, and I quote, "The leadership vacuum and turmoil at DHS may have contributed to the failure to anticipate and adequately prepare for the attack on the Capitol." The reference, of course, is to the January 6th insurrection. Their message was clear. The chaos during the previous administration hobbled DHS and put our nation's security at risk. The Department of Homeland Security has important and vast responsibilities. The Secretary must deal with natural disasters, transportation security, cybersecurity, international and domestic terrorism. Last October, during the previous administration, a DHS assessment of domestic terrorism, this was during the previous administration, found that violent white supremacy is, quote, "the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland." I've been sounding the alarm about this threat for many years. In 2012, I held a hearing following the massacre by a white supremacist of 6 worshipers at the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. I pressed the DHS witness to do more to address this threat. Instead, the department shuttered its only office dedicated to combating domestic terrorism and launched the controversial Countering Violent Extremism program, which focused almost exclusively not on homegrown terrorists, but on American Muslims. As the January 6th attack on the Capitol demonstrated, for too long our federal government has failed to address the growing terrorist menace in our backyard. I look forward to hearing from the Secretary on this and other important issues facing the agencies and what Congress can do to safeguard our nation. My Republican colleagues have strongly held views about the Biden administration and immigration. We've heard them many times, and I'm sure we'll hear them again this morning. It almost seems that they would like us to return to the policies of the Trump administration, and perhaps some do. Let me remind the committee, not only were President Trump's policies often inhumane and unlawful, they also failed to secure our border and fix our badly broken immigration system. The Trump administration separated nearly 4,000 children from their families between July 1st, 2017 and January 20th, 2021 under their, quote, "zero tolerance policy," causing permanent trauma to these kids. The Trump administration shut down legal avenues for vulnerable families and children fleeing persecution. This created a massive bottleneck at our border and supersized the backlog of applications that are still pending in the courts. The former president's attempt to repeal DACA, something that I take very personally, threatened young immigrants with deportation to countries they may not even remember until the Supreme Court announced in a majority decision that that effort was unlawful. This includes more than 200,000 DACA recipients who are, quote, "essential critical infrastructure workers," as defined by none other than the Trump administration's Department of Homeland Security, many of whom risked their lives to keep us all safe during the COVID-19 pandemic. The former president's attempts to terminate temporary protected status puts hundreds of thousands of longtime U.S. residents, including 130,000 essential critical infrastructure workers, at risk of deportation. The former president threatened mass arrest and deportations of millions of undocumented immigrants, including more than half of our nation's 2.4 million farm workers who've committed no crime and pose no threat to this country. This created rampant fear in immigration communities around the country, but it did not make us safer. In fact, the Trump administration endangered our national security by literally transferring billions of dollars in Department of Defense funds to build the president's so-called border wall. American taxpayers, not Mexican taxpayers, as President Trump had promised so many times, have paid dearly for this costly endeavor. Every dollar diverted from men and women in uniform for the border wall was appropriated by Congress to address a need identified in our military. This was not just an attack on Congress' power of the purse, it was an attack on military readiness. Secretary Mayorkas, you have a lot on your plate as a result of what you inherited. Let me be clear. I believe we can secure our border while treating people humanely. It is not only possible to do so, it is necessary. I look forward to hearing from you about the steps you're taking to enhance security, crack down on international criminal organizations, and particularly migrant smuggling, and to expedite asylum proceedings. I also look forward to hearing what you're going to do to restore America's longstanding bipartisan tradition of welcoming refugees. In the midst of the largest refugee crisis in the history of the world, the Trump administration set record lows for refugee admissions 4 years in a row. Sadly, in fiscal year 2021, which ended 2 weeks ago, the U.S. had admitted only 11,411 refugees, a small, tiny fraction of the Biden administration's goal of 62,500 and lower than any year during the Trump administration. I believe we must do better. It is easy to criticize the executive branch, but every member of this committee needs to look in the mirror as well. Only Congress can actually fix our broken immigration system. Of course, I'm concerned about the crisis at the southern border. Every member of Congress should be. The question is not only what happened, but what are we going to do about it? Congress, the Senate. Are we proud of our failure to pass meaningful immigration reform for the last 35 years? Congress bears responsibility for this. I've tried for many years to pass such legislation. Unfortunately, many times, some Republicans obstructed it. They filibustered the DREAM Act 5 separate times, and the Republican-controlled House blocked the 2013 comprehensive immigration reform that would have invested tens of billions of dollars in securing our border, something we all share. Even President Trump's acting Homeland Security Secretary, Kevin McAleenan, said that if he had passed the bill, quote, we'd be in a lot more secure on the border. This year, I convened bipartisan immigration negotiations over several months. We were unable to make progress. In fact, there were some who came forward and said, we have to cut legal immigration in the United States. But now we have another chance. I'm working to pass immigration reform through reconciliation, and still unresolved what that will be, but I hope it is achieved. The overwhelming majority of Americans support a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, many of whom risked their lives to get to America and to stay here and risk their lives again during the pandemic. This is a critical component of our economic recovery and rebuilding communities and cannot wait any longer. With that, I turn to Ranking Member Grassley for his opening statement.
I'm going to start by reading the oath that Cabinet people take before they start their job. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. Yesterday on TV, if you were watching, and it was reported, but you could also see people crossing the border in violation of our laws that are passed under that Constitution. I'm asked by Iowans, Senator Grassley, what are you going to do about the crisis at the border? My usual answer is, and I hope it's not interpreted by my constituents as avoiding my responsibilities, but I say we've passed all kinds of laws over the last several decades, making it illegally to enter the country unless you come here with our permission. So there's enough laws on the books, but the laws aren't being enforced. I'm glad that we're finally holding a hearing where we can discuss the unprecedented national security and humanitarian crisis the Biden administration has created at our southern border. U.S. Customs and Border Protection recently announced that it had 1.7 million encounters with illegal immigrants at the southern border fiscal year 2021. That's the highest number ever recorded. It's higher than the individual populations of at least 11 states. Of that 1.7 million, over 1.4 million encounters took place in the last 8 months of fiscal year 2021, when the Biden administration was in office and congressional Democrats had a majority in Congress. So, in a mere months of unified control of the federal government, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats have presided over 1.4 million encounters with illegal immigrants attempting to cross the southern border. That, on its own, is an astounding number, because under this administration, children have been detained under the same conditions for which congressional Democrats loudly and repeatedly criticized the previous administration. Make no mistake, this crisis is a direct result of irresponsible policies, reckless policies, dangerous immigration policies pursued by the administration and by you, Secretary Mayorkas, and political leadership of the Department headquarters, ICE, and Customs and Border Patrol. Don't just take my word for it. On March the 10th, Reuters reported that the government of Mexico was worried that the Biden administration's asylum policies were, quote, stoking illegal immigration and creating business for organized crime. It's been reported that cartels are getting rich. You have to pay to them to cross the border, to cross the Rio Grande. Former Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol, Rodney Scott, sent a letter to congressional leadership on September the 11th, stating that, quote, the seismic shift in border security and immigration policy that was initiated on January 20th, 2021, and the quote, created the current crisis at our southern border, and that this crisis constitutes a national security threat to our nation. And all you got to do is go back 3 or 4 months. We arrested 2 people from Yemen that were on the terrorist list of the United States. Scott served as Border Patrol agent and federal law enforcement agent for over 29 years and served under 5 different presidential administrations of both parties, including the Biden administration. He said that what he witnessed under this administration was, quote, a lack of any meaningful effort to secure our borders. In his professional assessment, quote, the U.S. Border Patrol is rapidly losing the situational awareness required to know who and what is entering our homeland. Mr. Scott also said that Secretary Mayorkas was, quote, choosing to ignore the sound recommendations of career government leadership despite his own admissions that he agrees with them, end of quote. This sorry state of affairs is entirely preventable. Unfortunately, due to the reckless policies of this administration and Department of Homeland Security, it was also entirely predictable. When you terminate physical barrier constructions, when you severely restrict the ability of ICE to deport illegal immigrants, when you terminate the Remain in Mexico policy, when you roll back asylum cooperative agreements, when you gut Title 42, when you openly support sanctuary cities policies, then you should not be surprised when there's a surge at the southern border. When you allow the ACLU and open border immigration activists, rather than career law enforcement professionals, to dictate the terms of your immigration and border policies, then you shouldn't be surprised when record-shattering numbers of people start showing up at the borders to take advantage of that situation. When you run DHS like it's an abolish ICE fan club, you shouldn't be surprised when you have an immigration crisis on your hands. The most solemn responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security is to protect the people of the United States. One of the most solemn responsibilities of the President and the Secretary of the United States is to uphold the rule of law in the United States, according to the oath that was taken by everybody in the cabinet. In choosing to actively ignore the immigration laws passed by Congress, and in choosing to pursue policies that encourage unprecedented levels of uncontrolled illegal immigration to the United States, this administration and this department have failed on both counts. I'm glad, after several months of trying to get this hearing, we finally have an opportunity to public to discuss with these leaders these issues and to hold these leaders to account. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. We welcome the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Honorable Ali Mayorkas, to testify before the committee. The mechanics for today's hearing are well known to the members. I will swear in Secretary Mayorkas. He will have 5 minutes to provide his opening statement. There'll be a round of questions. Each senator will have 7 minutes. 7 minutes. Please, no new questions after the 7 minutes are reached. Please try to remain within your allotted time. Following the first round of questions, if senators wish to ask additional questions, we will have a second round with 3 minutes each. Secretary Mayorkas, if you'd please stand. Do you raise your right hand? Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the Secretary answered in the affirmative. Secretary Mayorkas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. Every day, the 250,000 men and women of the Department of Homeland Security confront critical and complex challenges as we work to achieve our noble mission of safeguarding the American people, our homeland, and our values. The dedication and talent of our extraordinary workforce is unsurpassed, and I am privileged to serve alongside them. Our department is expansive, the third largest in the federal government, and our more than 20 agencies and offices join forces and work together to fulfill the many different responsibilities we have. From investigating, apprehending, and helping bring to justice those who heinously exploit children, to rescuing those in distress at sea, our personnel do so much in the service of the American people. In the short time I have, I will highlight our work in the fight against terrorism, enhancing our cybersecurity, rebuilding our immigration system, bringing to safety those who supported us in war, and combating climate change. I look forward to speaking of so much more in response to your questions. First, our work in the fight against terrorism. Over the years, we have built a rigorous and multi-layered security, screening, and vetting architecture to combat the evolving terrorist threat. We remain ever vigilant in protecting our homeland from foreign terrorists seeking to do us harm, while combating homegrown and domestic violent extremists who now pose the most significant and persistent terrorism-related threat facing our country. Last week, we issued our fourth National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin in line with our commitment to communicate with the American public about the evolving threat landscape facing our homeland today. Over the past 9 months, we established a dedicated domestic terrorism branch within our Office of Intelligence and Analysis, launched the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnership to provide communities with evidence-based tools to prevent individuals from radicalizing to violence, and redoubled our efforts to share timely and actionable information with our partners across every level of government. This year, for the first time, we designated combating domestic extremism a national priority area in our FEMA grant programs, resulting in at least $77 million being spent on capabilities to detect and protect against this threat nationwide. Second, as cyber threats have grown, so have our efforts to strengthen our nation's cybersecurity resilience and protect our critical infrastructure. Ransomware incidents have been on the rise, with victims paying an estimated $350 million in ransoms last year, a 311% increase over the prior year. This summer, alongside other federal partners, DHS launched StopRansomware.gov, the first whole-of-government website to combat ransomware by helping organizations of all sizes mitigate their risk and increase their resilience. Through CISA, our nation's cybersecurity quarterback, we announced the creation of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, a public-private partnership that will prevent and reduce the impacts of cyber intrusions and ensure a unified response when they occur. 2 weeks ago, CISA issued a binding operational directive requiring federal civilian departments and agencies to protect against more than 250 known cyber vulnerabilities. TSA issued 2 new security directives to better protect our nation's critical pipelines, and the agency continues to explore additional steps to expand protections for surface transportation, aviation, and rail transit entities. CISA and our Office of Intelligence and Analysis are working with all 50 states, local jurisdictions, and election technology experts to keep our elections secure. We are developing a more skilled, robust, and diverse cybersecurity workforce. In May, we initiated the department's largest and most successful cybersecurity hiring initiative in its history. Yesterday, we launched the DHS Cybersecurity Service to enable our department to better compete for top-tier and mission-critical cybersecurity talent. Third, we are addressing irregular migration and working to rebuild a safe, orderly, and humane immigration system. The challenge of doing so is made more difficult by the ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and a system that was decimated by the prior administration. We must invest in addressing root causes, creating legal pathways, and ensuring swift adjudication of asylum claims. The immigration system, though, is fundamentally broken, a fact that everyone agrees upon. Congress must pass legislation to fix it. In the meantime, we are taking action within our authorities. We are enforcing our immigration laws, including those of accountability and humanitarian relief. We are enforcing expedited removal, operating repatriation flights, and investigating and disrupting the smuggling and drug trafficking organizations. We have leveraged FEMA's coordination capabilities, activated our volunteer force of employees from across the department, and expanded our processing capacity. We have proposed a new regulation to streamline the asylum process to fairly and efficiently adjudicate claims, resulting in the prompt approval of those who qualify and the prompt removal of those who do not. We are expanding safe and legal pathways, such as the Central American Minors Program and the Haitian Family Reunification Program. We increased the number of H-2B visas available for fiscal year 2021, creating the opportunity for individuals to work legally and on a temporary basis in the United States in positions that would not otherwise be filled. We also added 6 new countries to the list of those eligible for H-2A and H-2B temporary worker visas. We are acting to protect dreamers by preserving and fortifying the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals policy. We are focusing our civil immigration enforcement priorities on individuals who pose a current threat to national security, public safety, and border security. We are focusing our worksite enforcement actions on unscrupulous employers who exploit the vulnerable, create an unfair labor market, and harm law-abiding employers who follow the rules. We are performing this work with an unwavering commitment to protecting privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties, and making risk-based investments to combat real threats to our communities. Fourth, the Department is proud to lead the coordination of Operation Allies Welcome, our whole-of-government effort to resettle vulnerable Afghan nationals in our country. A significant percentage of these individuals work for the U.S. government or our coalition forces, or are a family member of someone who did. Many are family members of American citizens and green card holders. Others worked as journalists, human rights activists, or on humanitarian missions. Along with our law enforcement and intelligence community partners, we are employing a multi-layered and rigorous screening and vetting process that begins overseas before individuals are cleared to travel to the United States, and it continues upon their arrival in this country. We are also ensuring that Afghan nationals arriving in the United States undergo medical screenings, receive appropriate vaccinations, and can build a new life for themselves and their families. This work is being done in close collaboration with state and local governments, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector. We are grateful to Congress for providing funding to support this historic cause. Finally, we are combating the existential threat posed by climate change. To help communities recover and remain resilient, President Biden doubled the size of the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, dedicating $1 billion to wildfire resilience efforts, flood control initiatives, and much more. DHS also authorized nearly $3.5 billion in hazard mitigation grant program funding to help states, tribes, and territories adapt and prepare for the impacts of the climate crisis. Further, FEMA revised its policies to overcome historic inequities in its aid programs. 2 decades after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security remains focused on protecting our country from evolving threats. We can execute this critical mission because of our incredible workforce and our key partners, the members of this committee, our allies abroad, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and local communities. Thank you for your continued support. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. One of the issues that was raised by Senator Grassley, and we've certainly heard repeated over, is the response to the zero-tolerance policy of the Trump administration. It's my understanding that President Biden's interagency task force on reunification of families identified 3,914 children separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border between July 2017 and January 2021, when President Trump left office. Of these, 2,073 have been reunited with their parents through previous court orders and via the efforts of this task force. That leaves approximately 1,800 children who were separated during the Trump years, who, according to this task force report, have not been reunited with their parents. What is the current status of these children?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your question. I had the opportunity to actually interview parents whose children were ripped from their arms under the prior administration, and tragically, the trauma of that separation, even though they are now physically reunited, continues. I lead that task force, and we have a wonderful executive director who works day to day in the effort. We have taken quite a number of measures to reunite the families who were separated under the prior administration. We recently launched a website where families who were indeed separated can register for relief. We are working very closely with counsel for the families. We are working with the governments, the nations of origin to accelerate the provision of passports for parents who do indeed want to come here.
So let me ask you, Mr. Secretary, you've heard the criticism that you're doing exactly the same thing that Trump did with zero tolerance. Are you, in fact, forcibly separating children from their families without good cause?
Absolutely not. And let me also say that we are working with international organizations, including the International Organization for Migration, to work with trusted voices to rebuild the trust of the parents that the prior administration destroyed, so they have the courage to come forward and be reunited with their children.
Mr. Secretary, you know my interest in the DREAM Act and DACA, as well as DAPA, and the efforts that Congress has been involved in. We had court decisions on President Trump's effort to eliminate DACA protection for the thousands who received it. What efforts is DHS making to reduce the backlog of DACA renewal applications? At the end of June, I understand 84,000 requests were pending, including 13,000 renewals for more than 120 days. What are you doing about it?
Mr. Chairman, our efforts are well underway in that regard. We are prioritizing applications based upon their expiration date so that we make sure that no lapses in deferred action for childhood arrivals eligibility occur. We are also, when we renew an application, we are making it effective upon the date of expiration so that there is no gap in eligibility of those.
So what's the backlog now?
Mr. Chairman, I'll have to get back to you on the precise number of that backlog, and I will do so.
I hope you'll do it promptly.
We have worked very, very vigilantly to reduce it.
The phrase catch and release is used by your critics to suggest that some people who manage to get across the border and make some claim to have a right under asylum law to be in the United States are released and never seen again, that they are somehow go into the nation at large, don't show up for their hearings, and that it's worse now than it was under the Trump administration. Is that true?
Mr. Chairman, the term catch and release has been used very loosely for many, many years across different administrations. Individuals who are not removed, who are not expelled under the CDC's Title 42 authority are placed into immigration enforcement proceedings. Those who abscond are a priority for removal under the immigration enforcement priorities that I issued on September 30th.
Do they show up at their hearings?
The great majority do, Mr. Chairman.
And are there conditions that you can suggest would make it more likely that they show up at their hearings?
And we are imposing those conditions, Mr. Chairman. We have alternatives to detention for those who are not in immigration detention. We have imposed conditions of parole with alternatives to detention, and those conditions better assure their appearance in court. We are communicating with individuals most effectively because sometimes it is not an intent to abscond, but a misunderstanding of the requirements in a very labyrinthian immigration system. But we are really focused on this effort.
Another one of the Fox greatest hits are that you don't do COVID-19 testing, and that in fact you're turning these migrants loose at our border without a test, and they are spreading COVID-19 across our country. Is that true?
Mr. Chairman, we test migrants. We place them in isolation or quarantine as the results of those tests require. We have built an architecture with non-governmental organizations and across the federal enterprise to test migrants. And in fact, when non-governmental organizations assist us in that effort, we have provided for FEMA reimbursement for them through the states if those states cooperate with us.
We know that smugglers are endangering and exploiting those migrants who are anxious to find a better place to live. We saw that just recently in Del Rio, Texas, when so many Haitian immigrants seemed to appear almost by design, tens of thousands of them. How did they happen to all come together during that period of time?
Mr. Chairman, we have a number of efforts directed at tackling the smuggling and trafficking organizations. Operation Sentinel is one of them, where we are going after their logistics and watching the money and apprehending them that way. I have met several times with the Attorney General of Mexico and assisted in the apprehension of organizational leaders. We are very focused on the organizations that exploit the vulnerable and facilitate irregular migration and illegal crossings.
My last question, what is the backlog in our immigration courts? I understand it was 1.4 million cases at the beginning of the Biden administration. Has there been any progress made?
There has been modest progress, Mr. Chairman. This is something that we are very focused on. This has been an enduring challenge. It speaks to the fact that our immigration system is broken and in dire need of legislative fix.
Senator Grassley.
Welcome, Secretary. On October the 28th, the Wall Street Journal reported that your department and several other federal agencies are involved in talks to offer massive financial payments to illegal immigrants. This is being done in order to settle litigation regarding the zero-tolerance enforcement policy. As you can imagine, many Americans think it's a pretty outrageous idea to offer massive taxpayer-funded payments to illegal immigrants who broke our laws, particularly in the middle of a record-shattering border crisis that this administration has created. The Journal made it clear that DHS is involved in these discussions. As the leader of your department, presumably you've been kept in the loop. Were you aware of the payments amounts under consideration?
Ranking Member Grassley, the Department of Justice is leading the negotiations in litigation arising from the family separation policy of the prior administration. I am not involved in those negotiations. I must defer to the Department of Justice. My focus in leading the task force is to reunify the families who were separated under the prior administration.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, the White House, Deputy Press Secretary, and the ACLU have all already offered public comments on these settlement discussions, so we expect you to answer questions about DHS's involvement in the case. So you're saying that there's no involvement?
I am not aware of our involvement in the Federal Tort Claims Act that are being handled by the Department of Justice. My focus is on the reunification of the families, the parents who were separated from their children.
Under the Department of Defense Death Gratuity Program, the family of a service member who dies on active duty receives a tax-free payment of $100,000. Under what circumstances, if any, do you think it's appropriate for an illegal immigrant who broke our laws to receive more money from the government than the family of a fallen service member receives under that program?
Ranking Member Grassley, when an individual sacrifices his or her life in the service of our country, wearing our nation's uniform, the family and all loved ones make that sacrifice as well. And my heart goes out to the families of those whom we have lost. I must again defer to the Department of Justice with respect to the negotiation in litigation of federal tort claims. That is not within my province.
The Wall Street Journal piece, it indicates that at least one of your department's attorneys complained that the illegal immigrant payout under discussion would be more than some 9/11 victims' families received under that program. Under what circumstances, if any, do you think it's appropriate for an illegal immigrant who broke our laws to receive more money from the government than any one family in the 9/11 victims?
I had the heartbroken honor of meeting a number of families who lost loved ones as a result of 9/11 on the 20th anniversary of that tragic day. And we are devoted to the well-being of those families. Again, Ranking Member Grassley, the resolution, the negotiation of the Federal Tort Claims Act arising from family separation is not within the jurisdiction of the Department of Homeland Security.
Well, I'm not asking you to comment on ongoing negotiations or legal matters. I'm asking you for your opinion on when it's appropriate for an illegal immigrant to receive more money from the government than the family of 9 election victims. I don't think you're going to answer that question, so I'm going to go on. There are approximately 1 2/10 million illegal immigrants in the United States with final orders of removal. These are people who have received due process and been ordered removed by an immigration judge. In your September 30th memo, you said, quote, that the fact that an individual is a removable non-citizen should not alone be the basis of an enforcement action against them, end of quote. Does that reasoning apply to the 1 2/10 million illegal immigrants who have received due process and been given a final order of removal by an immigration judge?
Ranking Member Grassley, the policy that I issued on September 30th, I drew from tremendous experience, not only as a member of the Department of Homeland Security, but as a federal prosecutor. We cannot remove 1.2 million individuals, nor can we remove more than 11 million undocumented individuals who are unlawfully present in the United States, who might not have final orders of
You might be right on that point, but my question is, does the reasoning apply to the 1 2/10 million illegal immigrants who have received due process? I just want to know if it applies to that group of people.
It certainly does, and however, I would not necessarily accept the fact that all of them have received due process.
Do you agree that all these individuals should be removed from the United States? I guess you said you couldn't remove 1 2/10 million. Should any of them be removed?
Of course, I do believe that individuals who pose a public safety threat, who pose a national security threat, who pose a border security threat should be removed. And we should be smart and effective in our use of resources, and we should focus on the well-being of our communities and prioritize individuals for removal, just as I did as an assistant United States attorney, just as any responsible prosecuting office does in this country.
I heard you say you want to do your job. Let me ask you this, the last question. Have any migrant families at all been separated during the Biden administration? Were any migrant families separated during the Obama administration, during which you served in multiple senior positions at DHS, including Deputy Secretary?
Ranking Member Grassley, no member of a family was separated consistent with the policy of the prior administration to purposefully separate a child from the parent for the sole purpose of deterring irregular migration of others. We ended that cruel policy on day one of this administration.
Thank you, Senator Grassley.
I wish I had an answer if any members were so deported.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Mayorkas, I've known you for a long time. It's very good to see you sitting there. And I thank you for your service. I want to ask a controversial question, and it has to do with guns. Each year, or excuse me, last month, TSA announced that their officers have seized 4,495 firearms at security points this year. That's a new record in the agency's 20-year history. Having an average of more than a dozen firearms seized at airport checkpoints each day is really troubling. So what is happening? To what do you attribute this increase? And how is TSA combating this very concerning issue?
Senator, it is wonderful to see you, and I am grateful for the support you have provided me throughout my enforcement career.
Could you speak up, please? I don't want to miss it.
I just express my gratitude to you, Senator, for your support
Thank you.
throughout my enforcement career.
Thank you.
And it is wonderful to see you.
Thank
It is
you.
difficult to understand the cause for the increase in the carrying of firearms, the attempted carrying of firearms through security checkpoints in airports. I can assure you, Senator, that TSA is doing everything possible to both interdict that and to prevent it from continuing to occur. We have been very robust in our communication to the American public that that offense will be dealt with criminally, if appropriate, and certainly civilly as well. We must put an end to that. It jeopardizes people in the airports and, of course, our own personnel, our frontline personnel, who risk their lives every day in the service of our country.
Well, I thank you for that. Since 2012, a total of 12.7 million acres have burned in my state. That's 1 out of every 8 acres in California. 53% of the forest in California is federal. Federal salaries were way down. We have now changed that to enable them, the position of wildland firefighter to be boosted substantially. What can your agency do to help control fire, which is going to get worse as the climate gets larger, and particularly in big states, with 53% of our forest land in California being federal?
Senator, we're doing a number of things under the President's leadership to address the existential threat of climate change, and wildfires in the West is one example of that threat. We have increased grant dollars to states and local communities to build resilience to fires and, importantly, to focus on preventive efforts. Our Office of Science and Technology is developing in-ground sensors that can better detect when a fire may actually break out. We have an all-of-department effort in this because we understand both the gravity and the breadth of the threat that climate change, including the spread of wildfires, poses to our well-being.
Do you support an increase in the salary of wildland firefighters, that in terms of a comparison with California, they're non-competitive and we have 500 vacancies? We have the legislation pending to correct that, and I would hope that you would support it.
I look forward to doing so, Senator.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. Senator Graham?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Glad you recovered from COVID, and to the extent we work together, I'd like to do that. Let's just pull back a little bit and just ask some basic questions. Do you believe that the Biden immigration policies are successful?
Senator, I think rebuilding a broken immigration system and rebuilding a dismantled one takes time, and we're on the road to success.
So you think we're on the right track as a nation?
I do.
Okay. How would you grade yourself?
Senator, I'm a tough grader on myself, and I give myself an A for effort, investment in mission, and support of our workforce.
Okay. Do you think you're doing a better job than the Trump administration?
Senator, I believe in the policies that we are putting forward, and I condemn a number of the policies that were promulgated in the prior administration.
So you think we have more control over the border now than we did under Trump?
Senator, we're very focused on the number
That's
of
not the question. Do you think we have more control over the border now than we did under the last administration?
I think we have more control that is consistent with our values as a nation.
Okay. Was Afghanistan a successful withdrawal?
Senator, the evacuation that the Department of Defense and the Department of State led was historic in evacuating so many individuals.
Of those that are evacuated, how many of them were vetted before they got on the plane?
Senator, it is our policy to vet
That's a simple question. How many of them were vetted before they got on the plane?
out of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Cannot speak to that, but it is our policy.
So you can't tell us how many people were vetted before they got on the plane to come to America?
Oh, I'm sorry. If you're speaking of the plane to come to America, let me, if I may, Senator, explain the process. Because We, working with our allies,
Okay, here's a question. Very simple. Those that got on the plane,
for America, it is our policy to
please
vet-
listen to my question.
I apologize.
To those who got on the C-17s and other planes, how many of them were vetted before they got on the plane by American officials?
To the United States, it is our policy to vet and screen 100% of them.
So 100% of those people that got on the plane were vetted. That's your testimony under oath.
It is our policy to do so.
That's not, I don't care what your policy is. I'm asking how many people were vetted before they got on the plane. Do you know the answer?
Senator,
If you don't know, just say I don't know.
Senator, I do not know if anyone boarded a plane that was not fully screened and vetted.
Can you tell me that
However,
all
I
the
can-
people that got on the plane were vetted
Absolutely, I can tell you that all of the individuals,
before they got on the plane?
if I may, Senator, all of the individuals who arrived in the United States
Okay?
have been screened and
That's
vetted.
not, listen, I'm not trying to trick you. I'm trying to ask a simple question. We've had thousands of people that got on C-17s and flew out of the most chaotic situation I've seen since the fall of Saigon. And I'm asking you, before they got on the plane, how many of them were vetted by the United States? Can you tell me what percentage?
Senator, I would posit, and I will confirm this, that well over 99% of them were fully screened and vetted before they boarded a flight.
Okay?
If, in fact, any of
Where do
them
you
were
get that
not-
information from?
May I, Senator?
Sure.
If, in fact, they were not, they were screened and vetted while in flight, and if any derogatory information was adduced, they were placed in immigration enforcement proceedings and in removal.
Now, you do know you're under oath. Are you
Yes.
telling this committee under oath that 99% of the people who got on these planes in Afghanistan were vetted by our government before they got on that plane?
I want to be very clear because precision.
Because you're not.
No. Senator, if I may, you are asking me about planes from transit countries, the third countries.
I'm talking about people who got on the plane
To
in
the
Kabul
United
Airport.
No, I can't speak to that.
Well, that's, okay, good. Of the 1.7 million people who've come here illegally, how many of them have been released into the country?
Senator, I can break that down to the best of my ability. Nearly 1 million, approximately, I would say 965,000, have been subject to expulsion under Title 42 of the United States Code.
Okay, that gives us how many left?
I believe approximately 40,000 have been removed under our immigration authorities that we in the Department of
Okay,
Homeland
slow
Security.
down. Where that gets us to, like 840,000 people?
No. Approximately 965,000 were expelled.
Okay,
Approximately 40,000 have been removed. Approximately 125,000 unaccompanied children have been transferred to the custody and the shelter of Health and Human Services. The balance are, to the best of my knowledge, in immigration enforcement proceedings where.
so what does that leave us? How many people are still here? Of the 1.7 million, how many people are still here?
I would estimate approximately 375,000 are. in
Still
proceedings.
here?
Yes.
Okay.
Senator. That is my best estimate. and
Do
I
you
will-
believe, right, do you believe that if you have an immigration hearing and there's a final order of deportation, that person should be removed?
I do.
Okay, why is 1 million people still here after they get a final order of deportation?
Senator Graham, as I responded to.
Well, is the system working?
Oh, the immigration system is broken, has been broken.
Well,
for
let me just say
decades.
this, it's really broken if 1 million people have been ordered to leave and they haven't left. Do you believe that the Remain in Mexico policy instituted by the Trump administration is cruel?
As it was implemented, I do.
Do you support permanently doing away with the Remain in Mexico policy?
I do.
Do you think that will increase illegal immigration if we do?
I do not, because of the other efforts that we have underway.
Thank you, Senator Graham. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary, if I could direct your attention to cybersecurity for a moment. There are 57 inspectors general in the federal service. About half of them are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and the other half are direct agency appointees. That's an awful lot of inspector general offices to have cybersecurity experience at the levels that we require. I'm wondering what the department, specifically the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, is doing to coordinate with those inspectors general and make sure that they are operating at the kind of levels of expertise that we need to defend their agencies against cyber attacks.
Senator, I know that CISA, its acronym, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, just issued a binding operational directive to federal agencies and departments across the enterprise to make sure that they are addressing known cyber vulnerabilities.
So why don't we move this offline, and you can follow up with a question for the record, or you can have the right person in your agency call. But I think that our cyber expertise in the Inspector General Corps should be concentrated someplace so that all these inspectors general have access to expertise, and we don't have to develop it in 57 different inspector general offices. And I think that's an important role for CISA to undertake. And if you could follow up with me on what your plans are to bring all 57 inspectors general up to speed on cybersecurity, and whether some mechanism is required to do that. Would you do that for me in a response to a question for the record?
I most certainly will, Senator.
Okay, well, we'll take that as a question for the record. I also wanted to mention to you that Senator Graham and I have a piece of legislation to plug some of the enforcement holes regarding cyber attacks. It does really 4 basic things. One is to make certain cyber crimes predicates for RICO and for money laundering. You remember for your AUSA days how important something as a predicate can be?
I certainly do.
The second thing it does is it allows for the Department of Justice to enjoin and shut down botnets before they're engaged in fraud. We've had a lot of testimony in this committee that there actually is really no good use for a botnet, and to wait around until they actually go off and are engaged in fraud is a real mistake. So we expand the ability of the department to go to court and get injunctions against botnets, which they've used very successfully. That's the Department of Justice. We make it a new offense to attack America's critical infrastructure with cyber attacks. And finally, as you know, there are people who make it their expertise to provide the means of access for criminals to and through the internet to attack American victims. And those intermediaries who are just selling access, it's very hard to charge. So we have an offense for intermediaries who knowingly sell access to criminals to attack American institutions. We are working on getting that into the National Defense Bill that's going to be under consideration the next few weeks in Congress. And I would like to ask you to weigh in favor of that once you've had the chance to review that with your team. Would you do the necessary review and then get back to me and let me know that you will weigh in support of that?
I most certainly will, Senator.
Great. That's all I had. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Cornyn.
Secretary Mayorkas, there have been about 56,000 unaccompanied children that have come across the border since President Biden became president. As you know, once these children are placed with sponsors in the United States, there's a requirement that there be a 30-day follow-up telephone call to determine their status. You're aware of that, aren't you?
That is within the domain of Health and Human Services. Senator, I am not intimately familiar with the process once the child arrives in the shelter and care of HHS.
You don't know what happens to the children once they're placed with a sponsor?
It is our responsibility in the Department of Homeland Security to transfer the unaccompanied child within 72 hours to the care and custody of Health and Human Services. I know that HHS, of course, is responsible to place that child with a responsible family member or relative. And I don't know the details of the HHS process.
So once you hand them off to DHS, you wash your hands of that burden. Would it surprise you to know that just this last fiscal year, in the 38-day follow-up calls to sponsors of unaccompanied children, 18% of them did not answer the telephone, and there's been no subsequent follow-up on these children placed with sponsors, many of whom are not even related to these children. And frankly, the Biden administration doesn't know whether they're being forced into labor, being trafficked for sex, being abused or neglected. Would that shock you to learn that as many as 18% of those children the federal government has simply lost?
Senator, that would indeed surprise me, and I would respectfully disagree with your characterization of our responsibility. We don't wash our hands of a burden when we're dealing with...
Well, if you don't know what happened to them, they don't answer the phone once they've been placed with a sponsor, how would you characterize the complete neglect of the welfare of that child after they don't answer, the sponsor doesn't answer the phone, 30 days after they've been placed with, the children been placed with the sponsor?
Senator,
how would you characterize that?
Senator, I have confidence in the dedication of the men and women of the Department of Health and Human Services to act in the best interest of those children, and I defer your question to those dedicated men and women. That is
so it's I'm not asking about them. I'm asking about the policies and procedures of the Biden administration. Apparently, no one in the Biden administration cares about those roughly 10,000 children that don't respond, their sponsors don't respond to follow-up telephone calls. So frankly, we don't know what happened to them, good, bad, or indifferent.
Senator,
let me ask you about another topic. Recently, you issued new enforcement guidelines, September the 30th, 2021. And are you familiar with the notion of push factors and pull factors? I'm confident you are.
Yes, I am, Senator.
So push factors are violence, poverty, desire for a better life, things we all as human beings understand. Pull factors are incentives for people to make the dangerous journey to the United States in the tender mercies of the drug cartels and the criminal organizations. Do you agree? Maybe not entirely with my characterization, but those are pull factors?
I understand your point, Senator.
Yeah. Well, do you agree with Police Chief Magnus, who is the Biden administration's nominee for Customs and Border Protection, that a non-enforcement policy by the Department of Homeland Security when it comes to illegal immigration is a pull factor, encouraging more people to make that dangerous trip?
That would require me to speculate because we don't have a non-enforcement policy.
I'm just asking you whether you agree with Chief Magnus, the CBP nominee, whether a policy of non-enforcement would be a pull factor.
It could be.
When you issued these non-enforcement guidelines,
They are not.
you said this. You said the fact that an individual is a removable non-citizen is not alone to be a basis for an enforcement action against them. Is that what you said?
Yes, it is.
You don't interpret that to be a statement to the criminal organizations that smuggle people illegally into the United States or to the migrants themselves, that if you don't commit any other crimes other than illegally entering the United States, you are basically going to successfully navigate our immigration system and end up being able to stay permanently in the United States.
Absolutely not. That's 100% false, and I'll tell you why. If I'm
100% false.
Yes, and the reason is, one reason, if I may, Senator, is because recent border crossers are a priority for enforcement action. And so there is, in fact, no incentive to bring somebody here because that individual will be a priority for apprehension and removal from the United States unless they have a basis under United States law to remain here.
Well, we know basically, based on Border Patrol projections, that this figure, 1.7 million, doesn't include 385,000 or so people who simply evade detection by Border Patrol. We know that there are about 350,000 people who are subject to a notice to appear in court or a notice to report. By my count, that's 735,000 people who have successfully made their way into the United States. And what you're telling us is that unless they commit some other offense other than illegal entry in the United States, it's no concern of yours.
No, that is inaccurate, Senator, if I may. Those individuals who have received notices to appear are recent border crossers and are priorities for enforcement and removal from the United States. They will be removed unless they make a claim to an immigration judge that they have a basis under United States law to remain here, and the judge rules accordingly. If the judge denies their claim, they will be removed from the United States under the guidelines that I issued on September 30th of this year.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Senator Klobuchar?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Secretary. In the 9 months since your confirmation as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, you faced a series of unprecedented challenges, from addressing the threat of domestic terrorism and cybercrime to major domestic challenges, to challenges on our border during a global pandemic, to welcoming thousands of Afghan refugees and helping them find a home. I don't think anyone here believes that this is an easy portfolio. I remember President Obama saying that when he first got into office and was asked about a series of challenges that he confronted. So I want to thank you for your willingness to serve and the men and women of your department for the work that they do. I want to actually start with a positive topic, and that is the work that you and your crew have done in opening the land and air entry across our northern border for vaccinated visitors, an issue I've long been working on as head of the U.S.-Canadian Interparliamentarian Group in the Senate. I can tell you there were a lot of people celebrating in my state when we finally opened the border, not just for air, given that the Canadians were already open and you could fly from Montreal to Miami, but you couldn't drive from Thunder Bay to Duluth. So we're very pleased about this development. Could you talk about what implementation challenges the department has had since opening the border last week? I have not heard a lot about lines or the like, and I thank you for that. But could you tell me how that has gone across the border? I'm only aware of my own state.
Thank you, Senator. We're very pleased with the way it has gone. We communicated in advance of July 8th, the date on which we lifted the Title 19 restrictions at our land ports of entry, that people should be ready for increased wait times, which is natural when an operational change like this occurs, especially at ports of entry that are not modernized. But fortunately, with yesterday's historic infrastructure bill, we're going to really change that thanks to President Biden's leadership. But we have not actually experienced the long lines that we would have expected.
Okay.
We are really prepared for it. but they may come, and we're continuing to communicate with the public.
I appreciate that. So one of the issues we have, which actually the Canadians have been good to work with, they're our #1 trading partner, and we are so grateful to them. But one of the things is that we have parity between our two countries now on land and air. We have parity that vaccinations are required, which is a good idea, but we don't have parity right now on testing. It's actually on the Canadian side. The Canadian visitors need to get an expensive test in addition to the vaccination when they return. And it can be $70, it can be $200. And of course, that's stopping a lot of the more weekend visitors that might come to Minnesota, the day visitors that drive to Duluth. And I led a letter with Senator Collins, Schumer, and Crapo on this to the Canadian government, asking them to look at this, and I urge you to work with on this as well. It's not an American issue, it's on the Canadian side, and I've spoken to the ambassador, but it is a problem for the cross-border traffic. We want parity.
I will most certainly look at that, Senator.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the work the department is doing to identify, vet, and transport Afghan refugees into the U.S. So many of these refugees, as you know, worked with us, served our country. Our state has welcomed these refugees with open arms, and I've been working with Senator Coons on legislation to provide a pathway to permanent legal status for Afghan refugees who were evacuated. Do you agree that Afghan refugees who are here on humanitarian status should be able to apply for permanent legal status?
Yes, I do, Senator, and I do hope that legislation passes.
Thank you. Earlier this month, I introduced a bill with Senators Cornyn, Coons, and Murkowski to ask the Department of Labor to study the barriers that immigrants with advanced training, including refugees from Afghanistan, but not only refugees from Afghanistan, face in finding employment in the U.S., which is critical when you consider that 70 of America's Fortune 500 companies were started by people born in other countries. Our country has always been stronger because people come here and they start companies and they do really well and they employ tons of people. We also know in my state, especially in the tourism industries in northern Minnesota, as well as in the ag industries, we don't have enough workers right now, something Senator Tillis I know cares a lot about, which leads us to look at path to citizenship, or as what's considered right now in the bill in front of us, a work permit situation. How can Congress continue to support the department's efforts to make sure that America can benefit from talents and expertise of immigrants?
Senator, thank you very much for your expression of the value, the tremendous value and contributions that immigrants make to our nation's well-being. As Chairman Durbin articulated at the very outset, we all understand that our immigration system is broken. There is unanimity about that, and it is long past time that we pass legislation to fix it.
Thank you. A last question here. Along with Senator Blunt, I co-chair the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Caucus. Many of the members on this committee are members. It's very bipartisan. Over in the House, it is Adam Smith and Representative Adderholt that chair the commission. And that's why we've introduced the Adoptee Citizenship Act to make citizenship automatic for all international adoptees who were legally adopted by U.S. citizens as kids, regardless of when their adoption was finalized. Since 2004, international adoptions have fallen nearly 93%. And I have always viewed this, and part of it, of course, is the pandemic, part of it is things that Russia did, things that China did, but there's a whole lot of kids in other countries as well that need a loving family, and there's a whole lot of Americans that would like to adopt kids. We are proud that the domestic numbers have actually gone up during the last few administrations, with foster kids getting adopted. That's all good. But international adoption has actually been a part of the way that our country is connected to the rest of the world, not to mention the humanitarian issues. Will you work with me to identify barriers and find ways to ease the citizenship process for foreign-born adoptees, and also in general, as we're talking to the State Department, Senator Blunt and I, about this issue, to work to get back to the situation where we were welcoming adopted kids into our country.
Senator, I would be privileged to do so. I was privileged to work with then Senator Mary Landrieu on international adoptions, as well as with Ranking Member Grassley on that valiant effort.
All right, thank you very much.
Senator Klobuchar. Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Moments ago, you said you gave yourself an A, maybe an A for effort on dealing with workforce issues at the Department of Homeland Security. I know that's important. You rely on your people. Now, you've got about 17,000 Border Patrol agents. Is that right?
I'm sorry, we have about 17,000 on the border.
On the border, on the border. So
on the southern border.
Let's talk about those for a minute. 17,000 on the southern border. What happens, and this ties back to your desire to give yourself an A for effort on dealing with workforce issues, but what happens when you've got potentially thousands of those, a pretty large percentage, who might soon become ineligible to work based on their vaccination status? Does that hurt or help our operational control of the border?
Senator, I hope that doesn't prove to be the case. We are seeing a tremendous uptick in the number of Border Patrol agents along the southern border who are indeed receiving their vaccinations. I hope that does not materialize.
Oh, well, yes, you hope, but do you have a plan for maintaining this? Would you be willing to share that plan with us in writing in the next 2 weeks?
I would most certainly be pleased to do so.
I appreciate that. And on the topic of workforce relations, on which you give yourself an A for effort, what about the issue with your Border Patrol agents recently being accused by some folks in the media of whipping illegal immigrants, when in fact they were not? Why on earth did you not defend them? I mean, has no one in your entire department ever become aware of how one uses split reins when riding a horse?
Oh, Senator, let me say two things. Number one, I put 100% into my work, and I'm incredibly proud to do so. That's number one. Number two, I stand with the men and women of our department through and through, and I will not prejudge facts before.
Did you defend them when they were being attacked for whipping people, which they were not?
Senator, what I said quite clearly is that the independent investigation will determine the facts, and those facts will drive the outcome.
Okay.
Nothing less and nothing more.
Your response and your failure to defend them then and now is nothing short of morale crushing. If you want to maintain or obtain operational control of the border, which you do not now have, this is not a way to get there. Now the Department of Homeland Security's website, the whole reason for its existence, to a significant degree, involves a statement that's on your website of your department that states as follows, quote, managing the flow of people and goods into the United States is critical to maintaining our national security. Illegal aliens compromise the security of our nation by illegally entering the United States or overstaying their authorized period of admission, close quote. How is the department doing in that mission to maintain that operational control of the border?
Senator, we are enforcing the laws that Congress passed, and there are different types of laws, if I may. There are the laws of accountability, and there are the laws of humanitarian relief. Individuals who make a claim for asylum, who are encountered upon illegal crossing at the border, are placed into immigration enforcement proceedings, are able to make their claim for asylum before an immigration judge, and if their claim is successful, under the law, they are able to stay here. If their claim is unsuccessful, then they are removed from the United States.
Okay, so between January 1st and September 30th of this year, just the time period in which President Biden has been in office, there have been about 1.7 million illegal crossers that have been encountered at our southern border. And so this doesn't suggest to me operational control. This does suggest to me an administration that's willing to push on the pull factors that Senator Cornyn mentioned, accelerating them into the turn. It also is reflected in the Build Back Better plan with the full support of your administration, which paves a path for granting amnesty, turning on more of those pull factors. By the way, how many known gotaways have crossed our southern border in 2021?
Senator, I'll have to provide that number to you. I will certainly circle back with you or your team expeditiously. I don't think that the approximately 965,000 people who were subject to Title 42 expulsions under the CDC's authority would consider the border open. I don't think the 40,000 or so individuals who were removed under the United States would consider the border.
Yes, sir. I understand that, and that's great, and I appreciate the great work done by the men and women serving in your department. Operational control isn't deemed in place because there are some people who have been stopped. Operational control has to be measured by those who are coming in right now at a breakneck, record-breaking pace unlawfully. So here's what I don't understand. Maybe you can help me understand this. Does America have the capacity to help make sure that we take in every person, ill-intentioned or not, who wants to come to America? And what's the real limiting principle there? Because letting 2 million or so people in illegally across our southern border in a year, together with the fact that your administration is backing legislation that turns on more of a magnet, encouraging more people here to come unlawfully, seems consistent with that mindset that it's an unmitigated good.
If I may, Senator, so this will require further discussion, but let me make a few important points, if I may. First of all, there is a misperception that individuals who are encountered at the border and who are not immediately expelled under the Title 42 authority, or who are not subject to expedited removal and accelerated removal process are just let into the United States and left alone. And that is absolutely false.
Well, hang on a minute. Hang on a minute. Some of them are. Some of them aren't. Like Yuri Medina Ulloa, who's a 24-year-old Honduran man who was recently apprehended crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, where he fraudulently claimed to be a 17-year-old. He then ended up in Jacksonville, Florida, where a family took him in. Days later, he stabbed the father of that family to death. He was a 24-year-old, not a 17-year-old, as he claimed. There are people like him crossing, and with the assistance, with the approval, with the facilitation in some cases of your department, these things are happening.
That is inaccurate. I am aware of the case. That individual is being prosecuted. There is an immigration enforcement detainer on that individual.
Did your department, or did it not allow him in?
Senator, I'd like to not comment on the details because
I bet you would not like to comment on the details.
If I may, Senator, there is a criminal case against that individual pending. Whether or not that individual committed fraud and deceived our personnel is a question that may be relevant to the ongoing criminal prosecution, and so it would be inappropriate for me to comment on a pending criminal matter at this time.
What's inappropriate is
Thank
for
you,
your
Senator
administration
Lee.
to continue leaving these borders open
Thank you, Senator Lee.
while pushing to turn on the poll factors. That's wrong, and it's immoral, and it's harming the security of the American people.
Senator Coons?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and thank you, Secretary Mayorkas, for your thoughtful answers today, for your leadership in what is such a broad area of responsibility. The Department of Homeland Security faces an enormous range of challenges, from cyber crimes to climate change to migration to domestic terrorism. There's a very wide range of things we could be discussing today. Let me focus on a few. What I most appreciate about your leadership on the very challenging issues of immigration is your recognition that smart and effective enforcement must also be and can be consistent with our values, with treating people who come to this country humanely, even as you are trying to enforce our immigration laws and ensure border security. So let's start with the question of prosecutorial discretion, an approach that effectively makes any undocumented immigrant a priority is actually making no one a priority. You're proposing prioritization, using prosecutorial discretion to strike priorities. Why is that needed? Can you explain why an approach of having priorities is actually more humane and more effective?
Thank you very much, Senator. There are two reasons, and let me first at the outset say that the concept of prosecutorial discretion has guided federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies for years and years. When I was an assistant United States attorney, that principle guided us under the U.S. Attorney's Manual. There are two reasons in the context of immigration enforcement. Number one, we have limited resources, and if we do not establish priorities, we will not accomplish our mission most effectively of securing the well-being of the American public. Number two, there are more than 12 million unlawfully present individuals in the United States, many of whom have been in this country for years and years and have been contributing members of our society. One example, just one example, are the individuals who do the back-breaking work of picking food that arrives on our table every day. And so it is not only a matter of allocating resources smartly and effectively, but it is also a matter of justice.
Let me ask an additional question, if I might, about our role in Congress in contributing to resolving our broken immigration system. There's areas where our interest in strong border management and humane treatment of migrants can and should align. Creating an orderly process at ports of entry would disempower smugglers and help protect the safety of migrants. Addressing multi-year asylum backlogs will give migrants some stability while avoiding unhelpful incentives. And you've taken a whole range of initiatives, restarting, for example, the Central American Minors Refugee and Parole Program, which creates a safe pathway for applying for refugees in the United States, increasing the number of H-2B visas to a broader range of countries, creating opportunities for legal migration, improving the expedited removal process, creating a dedicated docket. I think there's lots of things we can and should do to build a safe, fair, and humane immigration system consistent with the rule of law, but we have to have patience to invest in the long term and willingness to make some fundamental changes. How do you think we in Congress can support your efforts through legislation?
Senator, you described the number of efforts that we have underway, promulgating them through policy as well as through regulation. The enduring solution is immigration legislation to fix our broken system, to bring much-needed reforms to our asylum system and to every aspect of our immigration system, so that the best and brightest, as Senator Klobuchar referenced, the individuals who can provide so much prosperity and create American jobs, who bring their talents and their energies to this country, actually have an ability to remain here and make those contributions. It's across the board in achieving the goals of family unity, economic prosperity, and humanitarian relief. The opportunities are tremendous. They have existed for many, many years, and I do hope Congress promulgates legislation for that enduring solution.
Well, at the very outset of this hearing, Chairman Durbin commented that, of course, he's concerned about the situation at the border, but we in Congress must act. Simply grandstanding and finger-pointing isn't going to solve a broken immigration system that has been an enduring problem over the entire decade I've served here across 3 different administrations. Let me move to the situation of our Afghan allies, which it should not be a partisan issue to welcome to the United States tens of thousands of Afghans who served alongside us. In the recent continuing resolution, we passed with very broad bipartisan support provisions to give Afghan parolees the resettlement benefits of refugees. I recently led a bipartisan delegation to visit Qatar and Germany to visit with Afghan refugees and to thank American service members, diplomats, and our allies and partners who've helped make this happen. My own home church is helping alongside Jewish Family Services in Delaware to welcome one of the first Afghan refugee families into Delaware, and we've got a lot of important work to do all over our country. This can and should be bipartisan. President Biden actually has before him this week for signature a bill I led with Senator Cornyn that would better protect federal law enforcement and employees overseas, including our Afghan allies. As Senator Klobuchar mentioned, I think this is an area that with bipartisan support, we can make great progress. Can you briefly say more about how Congress, through legislation, can bolster your effort to support Afghans?
Senator Coons, we are grateful for the support that Congress already has provided that you referenced. And I should say Operation Allies Welcome is something that has received support from both parties, irrespective of party affiliation, across this country. We hope that further legislation could indeed be passed that provides for these individuals a path to status in the United States.
Well, thank you. And I'm grateful for the service of Jack Markell, the former governor of Delaware, who is helping lead the coordination of Operation Allies Welcome. I'm grateful for your leadership and the men and women of DHS in helping facilitate this critical effort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Cruz.
Secretary Mayorkas, you testified several times that our immigration system is, quote, fundamentally broken. True or false, under President Trump, we saw the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years.
I don't know if it's within 45 years, but we certainly saw in 2020 a low level of illegal immigration. 2019 was
okay,
very
true
high.
or false, Secretary Mayorkas, this year, under Joe Biden, we've seen the highest rate of illegal immigration in 61 years.
Again, I don't know the number of years, but it's certainly a historic high, Senator.
So you're right, it's broken, but you broke it. Let me ask you, in the calendar year 2021, how many illegal immigrants do you expect to have crossed illegally into the United States?
I believe the total number of encounters, as has been referenced in this hearing earlier, is approximately just under 1.7 million.
But there's 2 months remaining. Is it correct that you project over 2 million illegal immigrants in 2021, calendar year 2021?
I believe that is correct, Senator, and over the last 3 months, we've seen a drop in the numbers by reason.
And how many children do you project in 2021?
I'm sorry?
How many children will have crossed illegally in 2021?
I believe that thus far, through October 31st, Senator, approximately 125,000 unaccompanied children have been transferred to the shelter and care of Health and Human Services.
Now, you told another senator you don't know how many gotaways there have been?
I will have to circle back, Senator, with that information. Yes.
So that wasn't a fact that you thought was relevant to this hearing?
Oh, it is absolutely relevant. I understand why the question is posed. It's a fact of great...
Okay, but you're not prepared to answer it. How about this? How many deaths, how many illegal aliens have died crossing illegally into the United States under Joe Biden's administration?
I don't have that data.
So the deaths, you didn't prepare that data either. All right, how about this? How many children have been in the Biden cages in calendar year 2021?
Senator, I respectfully disagree with your use of the term cages.
Fine, you can disagree with it. How many children have been in the Biden cages? I've been to the Biden cages. I've seen the Biden cages. How many children have you detained at the Donna Tent facility in the cages you built to hold kids? How many children have been in those cages?
Senator, I can provide to you the following figure that when, and let me say, that when a child...
It's a simple question. How many children have been in those cages?
I respectfully am not familiar with the term cages and to what you are referring. There are
enclosures in which they are locked in which I took photographs and put them out because you blocked the press and didn't want people to see the Biden cages. These secure facilities in which they are locked down in Donna, those facilities, how many children have been in them?
Senator, there are 3 types of facilities. There's
the Donna Tent cages, the Donna Tent city. Let's take the Donna facility. How many children have been there?
That is a soft-sided facility. It is not a...
Okay, are you going to answer the question, how many children have been in that facility?
I will have to circle back with you with the precise number.
Oh, by the way, here's a photograph of the Biden cages.
That, Senator, that is precisely why I articulated...
Children sleeping on floors, crashed in upon each other. When I took this photograph, the rate of COVID positivity was over 10%.
May I speak, Senator?
You can answer the question, how many kids have been in these conditions?
That is precisely why I stated in March of this year that a Border Patrol station is no place for a child, number 1.
Okay, but...
Number 2,
all right,
that is precisely...
Secretary Mayorkas, you're not answering my question, so let me ask you this. In the past year, has Joe Biden been down to see firsthand the Biden cages?
Senator, I will again
Has Joe Biden been down to see this facility? Yes or no?
The president has not been down to the
Okay, no. Has Kamala Harris been down to see the Biden cages, this facility? Yes or no?
The vice president was at the border.
Has she been down to see this facility? I know she went to El Paso. Has she seen the Biden cages?
They are not cages. And
What are these walls?
Senator,
Has Kamala Harris seen them? Yes or no?
Senator, the
It's a simple question. Yes or no? We don't need a paragraph. Yes or no? Has Kamala Harris been down to see these detention facilities?
she has not been down.
Okay. Has any Democratic senator on this committee been down to see the Biden cages?
I will once again disagree with your use of terminology.
These facilities, has any Democratic member of this committee given a damn enough to see the children being locked up by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris because of your failed immigration policies?
Senator, I cannot speak to the members of this committee. And
You don't know if any Democrats have been down there?
I believe Democrats have been down
To see this facility, yes or no?
on a facility. Whether they are members of this committee, I do not know. And
All right,
if
let me
I
ask you a
may
different question
actually
then.
say that what we did
How many women have been sexually assaulted being trafficked into this country in 2021?
Senator, I have no ability to determine how many
Okay, you don't know, so you didn't try to find out?
have been sexually assaulted in Mexico along the migratory.
All right, how about this? How many children have been sexually assaulted by traffickers or other people when they were coming in illegally?
I do not have that data. Sir.
Okay, so you don't know that either. Let me ask you this. How many illegal immigrants have you released into the United States who were COVID positive?
Senator, it is our policy to test individuals.
I didn't ask your policy. How many illegal aliens have you released who were COVID positive?
Well, let me just say, when they are released, they are placed in immigration.
How many have you released that were COVID positive?
I will have to get that number.
Okay, you don't have that answer either. All right, let's try this. How many illegal aliens have you released who had criminal convictions?
Who have criminal convictions in Mexico, in the
Criminal convictions in whatever jurisdiction.
those individuals, if they pose a public safety threat.
How many individuals with criminal convictions have you released?
Senator, I do not have that.
Okay,
number.
let's specify it more narrowly. How many murderers have you released?
I'm not aware of any murderers whom.
How many rapists have you released?
I'm not aware of any rapists whom.
How many child molesters have you released?
I am not aware of any child molesters whom we have released into the United States, and I should say that
Senior Customs and Border Patrol leadership have told me that your agency is slow walking and refusing to comply with the order from the federal court to return to the Remain in Mexico policy. What would you say to the judge if the judge was asking why you should not be held in contempt and incarcerated for defying a federal court order?
It is because we are implementing the court's order in good faith. We are working with Mexico. It requires a bilateral relationship and an agreement. And I should also add.
Have you or anyone on your staff expressed to Mexico to resist going back to this agreement?
No. And I should also indicate to you, Senator, that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, under the sex offenders operation known as SOAR, apprehended 495 individuals between June 4th and September 1st who committed sex offenses, and we're very focused on public safety.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That our immigration system is broken is an understatement. And this broken system certainly did not originate with the Biden administration. And the fact is the Biden administration was handed a system decimated by the previous administration. So working toward a long-term solution will take time, and certainly Congress should pass comprehensive immigration reform as we tried to do in a bipartisan way in 2013. Secretary Mayorkas, you were asked several questions by Senator Graham about vetting of Afghan evacuees. To clarify, did these evacuees fly directly from Afghanistan to the U.S.? And can you describe the screening these evacuees went through before they arrived in the U.S.?
Thank you very much, Senator. I was unclear whether Senator Graham was referring to flights from Afghanistan to third countries or with respect to flights from those third countries ultimately to the United States. The operation that we executed was working with our allies. We developed third countries that served as transit points where Afghan nationals, ultimately to arrive to the United States, would be screened and vetted. We deployed personnel and equipment to conduct that screening and vetting. That screening and vetting involves not only the Department of Homeland Security, but the Departments of Defense and State, working with our law enforcement and intelligence agencies across the federal enterprise. We vet both biographic and biometric information, and it is our policy to vet 100% of the individuals in those transit countries before they board a flight for the United States. I should also add, if I may, Senator, forgive me, that the vetting is recurrent. It is ongoing. And as we obtain more information, for example, at the military facilities, what we call the safe havens, where the Afghan nationals reside until they are resettled, they fill out paperwork. We ingest the information that they complete in that paperwork into our screening and vetting process, so it is recurrent, it is ongoing.
Thank you. So clearly, before these evacuees can come to our country, there is quite the process, vetting process. You had stated previously that you, quote, find it frankly abhorrent that we can proceed to remove a child who does not have counsel by her or his side, end quote, and that when a child is unrepresented, it becomes a more difficult case and a government lawyer has a lot more to do. In fact, recent data from our immigration courts show that from fiscal year 2018 through the first half of fiscal year 2021, unrepresented, unaccompanied children were 97 times less likely to obtain legal relief in immigration court than their unrepresented counterparts. So clearly, when a child has legal representation, that is better for all concerned. Can you tell us more about why legal representation of children in immigration proceedings is so essential?
Senator, thank you so much for your question. Immigration law is extraordinarily complex. The proceedings are very complex, and we cannot expect a young child to understand how to navigate a legal system, to identify the rights that they might actually have under United States law and vindicate those rights. And that is the reason why it is so difficult for a government attorney to make sure in achieving justice that the rights of a child are indeed presented to a court.
I'll never forget, Chairman, talking about going to an immigration court, which I have also visited, not the same court, seeing a tiny child being foisted up without any representation and facing the immigration court. It's inhumane. And this is why I have just reintroduced the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act, legislation to help challenges at the border by ensuring counsel for all unaccompanied children in immigration proceedings. And I hope that you can continue to view the importance of these children having legal representation. A lot is being said about the number of encounters at the southern border. And what is not being said is that most single adults continue to be expelled at the southern border using Title 42 authority before they can claim asylum. So these Title 42 expulsions basically encourages migrants to try crossing the border as many times as possible. This recidivism causes migrants to be repeatedly counted and doesn't seem to be a fair or accurate measure of border security. Can you tell us how high this recidivism rate is at the border and how much of the increase in encounters is due to these repeated crossings?
Senator, the number of recidivists is not immaterial. In fact, that approximately 1.7 million figure that has been cited before does include recidivists. In other words, it is not 1.7 million different individuals, but rather encounters, and there may be multiple encounters of a single individual. We've taken actually enforcement measures to reduce the amount of recidivism. For example, working with our partners in Mexico, we have been taking the removal flights of individuals and bringing them further into the interior of Mexico to make recidivism more difficult.
So my question was, do you have any kind of figures on what the percentage of recidivism is?
We do track that, Senator, and I will have to provide that to you subsequent to this.
Is it relatively high? So that the 1 point whatever figure is very inaccurate?
Senator, the 1.7 million figure is inaccurate, but we must recognize that the number of individual different encounters at the border is very high, in fact, this fiscal year 2021.
Yes. Thank you. Before I run out of time, I want to turn to pre-clearance. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has pre-clearance operations where CBP personnel are stationed at 16 foreign airports in 6 different countries through pre-clearance. We have no such facilities in Asian countries, and I hope that we can work with your department to create such procedures in Asian countries such as Japan, because pre-clearance makes it so much easier for travelers to come to our country because they are pre-cleared to do so in these facilities in foreign countries.
Thank you, Senator. I look forward to working with you towards it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Rono. Senator Hawley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, nice to see you again. You've testified several times already this morning that you have, I'm going to quote you now, rigorous screening and vetting in place. Rigorous is your word for Afghan evacuees, refugees who have tens of thousands of them who have been brought to this country after the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that this administration conducted, historically disastrous, I might add, in which 13 American service members were killed, including one from my home state, hundreds, maybe thousands of Americans left behind to the enemy, where they still remain. It's your testimony that rigorous screening and vetting has occurred. So I assume that you mean by that at least the standard refugee screening processes, if it's rigorous, it's at least the standard refugee screening process. Is that correct? Am I right about that?
Senator, I do think it deviates from the refugee screening, but we have taken steps to make sure that the program is indeed rigorous, and I use that term advisedly.
Yeah, I noted that you used it advisedly. It deviates, though, from the standard screening procedures. You're conducting in-person interviews of all of the refugees per the standard procedures. You testified that 100% of these people have been screened and vetted. So you're conducting in-person interviews per the standard procedures of all of these refugees?
Senator, our U.S. Customs and Border Protection personnel have physical contact and question each individual at the port of entry. If there is any question with respect to that individual, any derogatory information or any question that bears on the individual's safety, the safety of the American people, that individual can be placed in secondary.
Well, wait a minute. That's not my question. My question is, are you conducting the standard security procedure? Is the standard screening procedure for refugees is they are given an in-person interview to find out, for example, if they're a terrorist. So you said 100% of these evacuees are screened. Have they all been given in-person interviews per the normal process?
They have not all been given
Why not?
interviews because we have to be mindful of the fact that we were in an emergency situation to evacuate U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, special immigrant visa holders, and others who have
And what
on
percentage
site.
do those, the special immigrant visa holders and American citizens, what percentage of the total tens of thousands did those constitute?
I have that information for you. If you'll give me 1 minute.
The answer is it's an extremely small percentage. I mean, it's maybe a few thousand out of 60,000 who have come to this country. So my question is, why are you not conducting in-person interviews of the people who have been brought here to this country? Don't you think that's dangerous?
I do not, Senator. I think that if, in fact, there is information adduced that gives any cause for concern, number one, the individual is not brought to the United States.
Well, wait a minute. When you say that, I just want to be clear about this. When you say any information, you mean if they are already in our database as a terrorist or a criminal or a terrorist affiliate, right?
Senator, We capture the biometric and biographic information of the individuals in the transit countries.
Right, and if they're, I understand that, and if they're in our databases already as a terrorist or a terrorist affiliate or a known criminal, then maybe you're saying there's a fault, then maybe they get an interview. But what about, so that's fine, but what about the thousands, tens of thousands of people who aren't already in our database? The people who we don't know who they are, have they been interviewed?
Senator, what we do is we capture their biographic and biometric information. We screen
That's
them.
like a fingerprint.
A fingerprint, a photograph, biographic information, and we run it against our databases in our law enforcement intelligence and other holdings.
But you're not interviewing them, Mr. Secretary. It's not unless they're already in our database that you then bother to interview them. Do you know how many of the 9/11 hijackers, the 20 who tried to enter this country, do you know how many of them were given an in-depth interview by a trained official?
If I may walk through the process.
No, this is an important question. Do you know how many of the hijackers were given an in-depth interview?
I do not.
One. The answer is one. That person did not enter the country. The others were not given an interview. We know the outcome. For that reason, the 9/11 Commission recommended in-person interviews for all refugees and others brought to this country in these circumstances. That was 20 years ago. That's why the standard procedure is an in-person interview for refugees or visa applicants. Now, you've testified that you're not doing those interviews.
Not at all.
That they're not happening.
No, if I may.
You have just testified. You just said that they are not being interviewed unless they're already in our system as a known terrorist.
No.
That would have captured none of the 9/11 hijackers.
If I may, Senator, that is not, and I apologize if I was not clear. You are correct that we are not conducting in-person full refugee interviews of 100% of the individuals.
What
that
percentage
brought
are you
here.
conducting?
I don't have that information.
What number have been
What we-
interviewed?
What we are doing.
Wait. What number of the more than 60,000 brought to the country, what number have received an in-person interview before they came to the country? Because you said 100% are screened. So what percentage have been given an actual interview by a trained official before they come to the country?
When you're speaking of a full refugee-like interview, I
Right.
don't have that data. I will tell
Why
you
not?
that-
Are you not tracking it?
No, I don't have that data with me.
Why? I hear you. I understand what that means.
Yeah.
But why don't you? Are you not tracking it?
No, we have data in the Department of Homeland Security. You're asking me what data I have at my fingerprints?
Well, why don't you have it? You run the Department of Homeland Security. Why do you not know who has been interviewed or not before they're brought to this country? By the way, are you following what's happening to people who've been brought to this country? On September 19th, a female U.S. service member was assaulted by a group of male Afghan evacuees housed at Fort Bliss. September 5th, a report from your office, the DHS, from U.S. officials at intake centers in Wisconsin identified numerous incidents in which Afghan girls have been presented to authorities as the underage wives of much older men. Other reports of assaults and rapes by Afghan men for Afghan girls. These are some of the folks who have been brought here because they haven't been screened, because you haven't conducted interviews. Don't you think that's a problem?
Senator, those individuals have been screened, as I spoke of previously. And let me
You interviewed them.
Let me share with you that if an individual violates a condition of parole, there are two things that can happen. They can be criminally prosecuted depending on the reason for their violation.
Mr. Secretary, my time's
they
expired.
can-
I've got to turn it over to other senators. I just want to say the fact that you are not conducting the most standard interviews for tens of thousands of people brought to this country is astounding to me, and it seems to me you've not learned the most basic lessons that we learned on 9/11 since then, and the security risk is unbelievable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just to complete the response and to clarify, nobody becomes a permanent resident without that full interview. Is that correct, Mr. Secretary? That is correct, Senator. Is there anything else you want to add in response to Senator Hawley's question? I want to make sure that we understand that the incidence of violations of parole, which Senator Hawley correctly pointed to, is the great exception, the extraordinary exception, and not the rule. We are incredibly proud of Operation Allies Welcome and our ability to resettle individuals who have worked alongside us in the theater of war and who otherwise need humanitarian protection. Thank you. Recently, Mr. Secretary, I had the opportunity to visit Camp Upshur at Quantico and to see some of the work that's being done to resettle a portion of the more than 120,000 Afghans who have been evacuated so far. As you know, 75 to 80,000 of them are either in this country or will be shortly. That is a massive challenge to resettle in this country. And I have a very deep concern about whether there's a plan to do it, whether there are sufficient resources to accomplish this massive feat of resettlement. As you may know, my office and I have been involved in attempting to evacuate after the withdrawal of American troops, not only American citizens, but Afghan allies who are stranded and trapped there, potentially at serious risk. The 120,000 who were airlifted, many of them were not at risk, which is why they were able to make it to the airport. The ones at risk were fearful of going through the Taliban checkpoints. And so they are still trapped there with targets on their back because they sided with us. They put their lives on the line as interpreters and translators and guards and others who helped our journalists as well as our troops and diplomats and protected them. So now we have this tremendous challenge ahead of us, and what I've seen about the evacuation effort is a lot of agencies pointing fingers at their other, whether it's state pointing fingers at DOD or DOD pointing fingers at DHS, and at Quantico, there is an alphabet soup of different agencies on the ground working on resettlement. I want to avoid the same finger pointing when it comes to our resettlement efforts. About $6.8 billion have been allocated so far, as you know, in the CR to accomplish resettlement. I am deeply concerned, number one, with evacuation of Afghans still at risk there. I've called for an evacuation czar to avoid this kind of attempt to shift blame and finger point in enabling our Afghan allies, as well as American citizens, green card holders, still there to leave the country. But also, while here, we need a similar kind of czar with the status and credibility. I know that Jack Markle is going to be leaving to become an ambassador. That position will soon be unfilled. But even that position is not sufficiently elevated to accomplish this task, and the resources available are inadequate. So I have two questions, and please understand, I'm trying to help you to help us help you with resources. And I'd like to know, what is your timeline and what do you need in the way of support and resources to accomplish this feat? Because there are resettlement agencies, IRIS and SIRI in Connecticut are two. They are all around the country trying to help, but they need support from your agency and others in this alphabet soup out at Quantico and similar bases around the country. And I want you to help me to help you with this task, because very shortly, as you know, whether it's at Quantico or any of the other bases, the weather's going to turn bad, the tent cities are going to become mud cities, and the residents of those cities, the guests as they're called, are going to rightly be pretty unhappy, particularly children, and about half of them are children. And I just want to finish by saying how impressed I was by the Marines I saw at Quantico, by the personnel out there. They are all in. They are working with the guests I happened to meet, while I was there, among the guests, one of the families that was airlifted on one of the planes that my office was involved in arranging. One of the flights carried these people to freedom. It was incredibly moving for me to meet them and to know that they were there because of flights arranged in part because of my office. And I'd like you to tell me what we can do, because Americans should be invested in trying to enable these Afghans to escape. Senator, let me, at the outset, just thank you for your leadership on this and your concern for the vulnerable individuals who remain in Afghanistan. We, our commitment to them is ongoing, is continuous, and we've built a sort of a systematic approach to relief for them, and also for your concern with respect to resettlement. We're resettling, working very closely with the agencies, just over an average of about 4,000 Afghan nationals a week. Our timeline, thanks to the extraordinary work of Governor Markell and Bob Fenton, a FEMA Region 9 leader who's moved from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. to lead Operation Allies Welcome and our coordination efforts. We have a timeline of between December and February to complete the resettlement of the Afghan nationals here. We're very focused on jobs, on housing, and funding. We're grateful for Congress's assistance in that funding, and I'd welcome the opportunity to meet with you and discuss with you what other support we could really use to accomplish this mission. And I so greatly appreciate and value your leadership and commitment to it. Well, I appreciate your answer. I would like to follow up if I don't have a chance in the second round to be more specific, or if you don't feel you have the response now. But I think it is absolutely critical that we have a firm timeline and that we, in effect, strengthen or harden or weatherize and winterize the facilities on these bases before December and February, even if we're able to accomplish that timeline, and to know from you very specifically what additional resources, what dollar amounts you need. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. And thank you for your service. There's a famous movie line, I'm sure you've heard it. Deserves got nothing to do with it. Deserves got nothing to do with it. And I don't think you deserve to have to be here today to answer questions about immigration, because I don't think you're calling the shots. I think those shots are being called out of the White House. I think they ought to be here. The people determining our border policy, in your opinion, are they just incompetent, or do they believe in open borders?
Senator, I'm intensely and immensely proud to be a member of President Biden's cabinet, and for the policies that are promulgated, I should be held accountable.
Right. I looked last night at President Biden's platform when he ran for president. He supported amnesty for the 11.7 million people in our country illegally. He promised he would end the Remain in Mexico program. He promised he would end the Safe Third Country agreements. He promised he would get rid of the border wall. He promised to encourage sanctuary cities, and he said, I'm not going to deport people. Can we agree that you don't have to be Mensa material to understand that's an open border policy?
Senator, a few of your recitations, if I may respectfully submit, were not accurate portrayals of the president's policy. He did not say...
I looked up his platform last night. It's right there. I mean, here's what I believe on immigration.
Senator, again, I would respectfully disagree with your characterization of the president's policies. So, for example,
Well, let me ask you this. Okay, you say he didn't say this. The surge that we're having at the border, the 1.7 million people that have come into our country illegally, and the Washington Post says it's another 1,000 who are undetected. President says that happens every single solitary year. Is he wrong on that or right on that?
Senator, we encounter many, many people at the border every year. The number that we have encountered of different individuals this year is at a historic level. It's
Like
high.
the highest in 60 years, right?
As I mentioned earlier, I'm not familiar with the time frame, but it is certainly a historically high number, Senator.
Okay. Well, your administration has released thousands of people into our country who are COVID positive, have you not?
Senator, as I mentioned earlier, it is our policy to test and, as necessary, isolate and quarantine.
I know, but you've still released thousands who are positive, haven't you?
There have been individuals who have been released. And by the way, those individuals, just to be clear, because there's a misperception, those individuals who are not immediately expelled or removed under expedited processes are placed into immigration enforcement proceedings.
Right,
where
right,
they
but
are
I'm talking
required
about
to
COVID.
appear in court and stand before a judge.
Right.
And if they
Okay.
don't have a claim under law to remain in the United States, they are removed.
Your department has released thousands of people into this country illegally who are drug dealers, haven't you?
I'm sorry, Senator?
Your department has released thousands of people illegally into this country who are drug dealers, haven't you?
I don't, I'm not familiar with what you've just articulated. It is our policy that if an individual is a drug dealer and we encounter and apprehend that individual at the border, and the individual poses a public safety threat, and there are not conditions that are available to
Right.
us to ensure the safety of the American
But how do you
people.
know if
If I
1,000 a
may.
day, according to the Washington Post, are coming in undetected?
If I may, just to finish my statement,
I'm sorry.
if there are not conditions that can secure the safety of the American people, that individual is detained, is
Right.
placed in immigration custody.
Right, right. We know the superlative job y'all are doing. Your department has released thousands of people into this country illegally who have criminal records, haven't you?
Senator, individuals who are apprehended at the border are subject to a number of different paths. They can be expelled under Title 42 of the U.S. Code under the CDC's Public Health Authority. They can be placed into expedited
Mr.
removal
Secretary, I've got limited time, and I understand the procedure.
I know,
we
but
both do.
Senator-
But I'm just trying to get you to answer my questions. Your administration, the Biden administration, has released into our country people coming across the border, thousands of them, who have criminal records. Isn't that the case?
Senator, I'm not aware of thousands of individuals with criminal records who are released into the interior of the
All
United
right,
States.
let me try another one.
Who are not
Your
placed in-
department has released into our country thousands of people who have promptly gone on welfare. Isn't that the case?
I don't believe that individuals who are unlawfully present in the United States qualify for welfare, but that is something that I'm happy to follow.
You ever been to California?
I grew up for most of my life in California.
Okay, check their rolls.
I wasn't born in this country.
Yes, sir, I know. And I think we ought to tell the Cuban-American success story every chance we get.
Thank you.
I'm about to run out of time. Our Vice President Harris, our border czar, what kind of grade would you give her?
Vice President Harris is not the border czar. Vice President Harris has been asked by the President of the United States to focus on root causes.
Okay,
One
let
of
me
the
answer this
enduring
quickly in my
solutions-
last few seconds. When was the last time you talked to her about securing the border?
Several weeks ago.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator
landed
Kennedy.
on time. I want you to recognize that.
I sure do. You get an A+. Senator
Thank you.
Booker?
Yeah, thank you very much for being here, Secretary Mayorkas. I want to thank you and the incredible professionals, thousands of work under your command, and thank them for their work and their dedication to our country. I want to start off by looking at the American food system, which is savagely broken. It's hurting everybody from driving record, incredible, staggering numbers of independent family farmers out of business. It's hurting the end users. We're a nation where just 2% of our ag subsidies go to fruits and vegetables, which we're told to eat the majority of. It's a system that's hurting everyone. But I want to zero in on what's happening with people who are food workers, many of them who are immigrants, many of them who are undocumented immigrants. In your opening statement, you said, a reference to an October 12th memo called Worksite Enforcement, and you said the strategy is to protect the American labor market, the conditions of the American worksite, and the dignity of the individual. I'm wondering just about the threat of deportation and how that's serving potentially as a deterrent to immigrant workers who might otherwise speak up about unsafe conditions. I know you're familiar with the Mississippi raids targeting poultry workers, for example. About 2 years ago, where 680 workers were swept up in those raids in the aftermath of a $3.75 million settlement with the EEOC, and their charges were everything from sexual harassment and discrimination, real exploitation of these immigrant workers. And so I guess the question I'd like to know is that as you focus on civil enforcement on these unscrupulous workers who are putting people almost in like slavery-like conditions, or at least undermining their dignity, what, if anything, can the DHS do to incentivize and encourage immigrant workers to report abuses in order to protect their rights and defend the labor standards of everyone?
Senator, thank you so much for raising this issue. We've spent a considerable amount of energy focused on it. We have promulgated a suite of policies to get at the very heart of the issue that you have raised. Number one, you referenced our worksite enforcement policy, which focuses on the unscrupulous employers that exploit the vulnerabilities of those unlawfully present in the United States. We also promulgated a policy that our immigration enforcement tools cannot be used in retaliation for the assertion of workplace rights. Third, we promulgated a policy extending to individuals who do assert their rights, deferred action or other tools so that they can actually advance their interests, advance their rights without fear of removal from the United States. We have a suite of measures.
And what, can you be more specific about that? So in other words, if I come forward to report outrageous abuses from sexual harassment and violations to unsafe working conditions, my fear would be that I would be immediately deported or taken into custody.
So there are two aspects to that. Number one, you might fear your removal just by dint of the fact that you're unlawfully present in the United States. And that's precisely why the September 30th guidelines that I promulgated indicated that unlawful presence in and of itself is not a basis for immigration enforcement action, but rather we have to prioritize public safety, national security, and border security as the priority areas, number one. Number two, you might fear retaliation by reason of your assertion of rights, and we have called upon our DHS personnel to evaluate a case based on the facts and circumstances and determine whether we should extend deferred action, which does not provide the individual with status, but lawful presence, so that they do not need to fear removal despite our policies, and they could advance their rights and vindicate those rights and hold the unscrupulous employer accountable without fear of removal.
I'm grateful for that. Could you just correct something for me? A lot of my Republican colleagues have been critical of the Biden administration's handling of the situation at the border, as you know. But, you know, in reality, monthly encounters at the southwest border started rising dramatically a year and a half ago under the Trump administration. This increase was due in part to worsening economic conditions resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. That's true, correct?
Yes, it is.
And can you talk about that increase that started significantly under the Trump administration and often being driven by this pandemic?
So if I may, Senator, 2019 brought incredibly high numbers of encounters at the border, and much has been said this morning about the purported pull factors, but the fact of the matter is we have to take a look at why people leave their homes, why they flee violence, why they flee economic desperation, why they flee the disasters that result from climate change.
Right, and so this politicization of it, putting it all at one foot of one president over another, to me seems not to really be indicative of what the real problem is that began to be seen under the Trump administration, correct?
That's right, and that is exactly why.
And can I interrupt you? I'm so sorry. I've got 1 minute left. I want to try to get 2 quick questions in. There's been an expulsion of migrants under Title 42, which was the Trump administration. I think they called it the Stephen Miller special, where they were trying to use a COVID excuse just to expel, to remove people. Is the administration considering rescinding what, again, the Trump administration official, one Trump administration official called the Stephen Miller special, especially given that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention resisted Trump's administration's attempts to issue that order in the first place, being that it was unnecessary?
Senator, the CDC conducted an independent study with respect to the Title 42 authority. It determined that the public health imperative required its continued use. The Delta variant was a very significant reason.
So you're listening to the CDC as guidance for making your decisions?
It is a CDC authority, and
then real quick, the plan to provide COVID-19 vaccines to detained migrants was overruled, according to the Washington Post. I want to see if this report is true. According to the Washington Post, the plan to provide COVID-19 vaccines to detained migrants was overruled by the White House with a specific intent to deter immigration and asylum seeking. Is that true?
that is not. We offer vaccinations to individuals in ICE custody. We do not mandate it.
All right, and I'm going to submit to you a question on the expulsion of Haitian nationals for the record, and just appreciate your time. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you, Senator
Thank you,
Booker.
Senator.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here with us. I have to tell you, and I know you've heard it from others, so many Tennesseans that I talk to are absolutely outraged with the benefits and the handouts that are given to illegal immigrants, especially at a time when so many people are really suffering due to this oppressive inflation that we are seeing take hold of our economy. And we are finding ourselves in the midst of the worst border crisis ever. Now, my colleague talked about 2019, but also the number dropped in 2020 after the implementation of Remain in Mexico and the Title 42 positions. That dropped, and now, under this administration, we are at an all-time high. You are setting records. And now you're talking about giving immigrants, these illegal immigrants, $1 billion in settlement money. $1 billion is a lot of money. That's a lot of taxpayer money. So I'd like you to help me put these payments into perspective of that $1 billion. So how much of a border wall, if you want to talk about getting to root causes, build a wall. This is what our Border Patrol has been saying for 3 decades that they need. It's not Trump's wall, it's the fact that the Border Patrol wanted that. So how many miles of border wall would $1 billion build?
If I may, Senator, take a
No.
moment, because you've asked 2 very different
Yes,
questions.
I have. I want an answer to how many miles of border wall could you build with $1 billion? Obviously, you don't know the answer to that. The answer is 50 miles of border wall. And then how many Border Patrol agents could you hire with $1 billion? Something else the Border Patrol has said they need to secure this border.
Senator, may I speak to the number of questions that you have posed?
Let's go through these and then come back to that. How many border agents could you hire?
I would have
with
to
$1
get
billion?
back to you, but
I can tell you it's over 15,000 border agents. How many immigration judges? Another thing the Border Patrol has told us that they need at that southern border. How many immigration judges could you hire with $1 billion?
I would respectfully submit that you...
7,213 immigration judges. could be higher. These are all things the Border Patrol has said that they need. Now, Grassley asked you you responded to him on these settlements because the families are separated at the border. So can you sit here today and tell this committee that there hasn't been a single family separated since your administration? You told Senator Grassley you all ended that policy day one.
That is correct. We are not.
But you separated families, I know as late as March. That has been reported. So all these families that have been separated under the Biden administration, are you going to make a payment to them?
Oh, Senator.
Are they eligible?
Senator, your question, forgive me, your question is filled with inaccuracies.
Oh, no, these are things that we are pulling from.
Oh, no,
Border
Senator,
Patrol. Oh, yes. Okay, I'm going to move on. Are you compensating people for both short and long-term separations, days or weeks? Are you making any difference in that, or is it just a blanket payment?
Senator, the Department of Justice is representing the United States of America in federal tort
Under
claims.
what legal authority do you all have to make these payments?
Senator, if you were privy to my prior testimony, and please allow me to answer at least one of the multiple questions that you have posed.
Okay, I want to move on in the time I have left to a couple of other things. Are you familiar with the name Robin Pachero?
I am not.
Okay, Pascal Gaspar Andres.
I am not.
Or Gaspar Andres. Or Juan Carlos Morales Pedraza. These are just a few of the criminal illegal immigrants who have been charged with a convicted crime against American citizens since Joe Biden took office. This has happened on your watch. Pachero was charged with a hit and run. It left a father of two dead. The Andres were charged with stabbing a man to death. Juan Carlos Morales Pedraza he pled guilty to coercing a minor to engage in sex. So this administration's radical immigration policies are endangering Americans and costing some of them their lives. Does the Biden administration have any plans to issue million-dollar payments to the families of those who were killed or assaulted by illegal aliens?
Senator, in 2020, there were individuals who crossed illegally into the United States.
These are all on your watch.
And committed crimes.
These are all on your watch.
Is it your position that the prior administration bears responsibility for that?
I'm asking the questions, and these are all on your watch. The Build Back Better plan supports giving green cards to illegal aliens. There are many advocates out there that are trying to make certain that gets shoved into the Build Back Better. I call it the Build Back Broke. Do you support giving green cards to illegal immigrants that have entered this country? Yes or no?
Senator, I believe in immigration reform and legislation that provides a path to citizenship to those who meet certain criteria.
So you would support illegal immigrants having a path to citizenship and getting a green card when we have Americans that are out of work. Let me ask you this, yes or no? Have you ever visited the White House?
Have I visited the White House?
Yes. Have you ever visited the White House?
Yes.
So you're aware there is a fence around the entire perimeter of the White House to prevent unauthorized individuals from entering the White House, correct?
Yes.
And U.S. taxpayers are also funding a $500,000 fence around President Biden's Rehoboth Beach house, correct?
I'm not aware.
And your department is overseeing this construction. You should be aware of that. President Biden obviously likes walls when they protect him. So can you explain to me why a wall is effective and necessary at the White House and the Biden Beach House, but is not necessary at the southern border?
Yes, I can. May I have that opportunity?
It's up to the chairman. My time has expired.
You may complete the answer to the question.
There are thousands of miles along the southern border, and I agree with what then Senator McCain presented, which was there are different solutions for the border because of its tremendous expanse, the great diversity in the terrain that it must cover, And therefore, the key to border security is fundamentally advanced technology. That is the most effective means, because we're not going to construct a border wall on the ragged and jagged cliffs in certain parts of the border. And if I may, respectfully, Mr. Chairman, because I did not have a chance to answer any of the other questions, let me just respectfully submit that I disagree with almost everything that was articulated in the questions posed to me that I did not have a chance to respond to.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Number of questions. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. But first, I wanted to start with a couple of acknowledgments, beginning with, I was glad to see that you issued a new memo to terminate the Migration Protection Protocols, also known as MPP, in late October, about a month ago. This policy, as we know, has caused a great deal of hardship to individuals who must wait in Mexico for their asylum cases to be processed. In your memo, you mentioned that a more comprehensive approach is needed to address the root causes of migration, and that MPP is not an effective deterrence policy. I think the data, statistics that you've begun to share with this committee is evidence of that. While I understand that MPP cannot be terminated until the Texas court injunction is vacated, I've heard from many stakeholders along the border that there's no way to humanize MPP. I can imagine that these stakeholders have also been invaluable partners in ensuring that migrants are treated with dignity, and it will take a collective effort to reverse the long-lasting effects of MPP. So I implore you once again to rescind MPP as soon as possible. On a second topic, earlier this month, I was happy to see that the department will exempt filing fees and streamline application processing for Afghan evacuees who received humanitarian parole and are already in the United States. While I welcome this news and hope it helps our Afghan allies in their resettlement process so they can build a life here in the United States, we must not forget about those who are still outside the United States. I encourage the department to also waive the fees for those Afghans who are applying for humanitarian parole from outside the U.S. and to work with the State Department to facilitate their travel outside of Afghanistan so that their applications can be processed. I continue to hear from Californians about how helpful a fee waiver would be. I also sent a letter along with 26 of my colleagues, including many on this committee, making this exact request, which I would like to enter into the record. I urge the department to continue offering support to our Afghan allies inside and outside the U.S. Now to my questions. The first, which is a follow-up to something we've heard a lot from my Republican colleagues today, and that's about the increasing number of migrant encounters. Now, if I understand correctly, this is the third consecutive month of border encounters actually decreasing. So would you like to comment on this or shed some light or clarity on the more recent statistics and trends?
Thank you, Senator Padilla. We have indeed instituted certain practices, not just along the border, but also with our partners south of the border that have, in fact, borne fruit in terms of a reduced number of encounters of migrants along the southern border, whether it is enforcement measures, whether it is safe and orderly alternative pathways where people would not need to take the perilous journey and it can apply for relief from where they are. There are a number of measures, and I would be pleased to spend time with you sharing with you all of the measures we have taken.
Okay, we'd appreciate that and would certainly welcome that. Now, as this is an oversight hearing, I want to ask about some disturbing reports around the conduct and actions of Custom and Border Protection agents. A recent letter sent by the Southern Border Communities Coalition raises significant concerns about critical incident teams within the agency that are interfering with law enforcement investigation of CBP agents. According to the letter, these teams have been operating for decades and investigating their own agents without authority and may be obstructing justice by shielding agents from accountability. One case in particular that is especially concerning to me involves Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, who was a longtime resident of San Diego and a father of 5. In 2010, Anastasio was hogtied, brutally beaten, and repeatedly tased by border agents until he stopped breathing. The police record reveals that after the incident, Border Patrol agents destroyed, altered, and withheld evidence from the San Diego Police Department. This incident did not happen in a vacuum. Border Patrol abuses were displayed all over national media, more recently with the concerning treatment of Haitian migrants in Del Rio, Texas. I know how much you, Mr. Secretary, value integrity, and I hope you share my concerns that there are serious questions that need to be answered to protect the integrity of the agency. Secretary Mayorkas, what measures has the Department of Homeland Security taken towards addressing serious abuses of power surrounding these critical incident teams?
So there are a few things, if I may. First of all, Senator, I am immensely proud to work alongside the men and women of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and that includes U.S. Border Patrol. They do heroic work, putting their lives at risk to keep the American people safe each and every day. And the misconduct of one does not define the heroism and integrity of the great majority of the men and women. You know, this Friday we are going to be conducting a public engagement because we do not tolerate misconduct in any part of our workforce, whether that's U.S. Customs and Border Protection or any corner of the Department of Homeland Security. We're going to have a public engagement this coming Friday to discuss transparency and accountability in Customs and Border Protection. That is hosted by and propelled by the leadership of that agency. We take great pride in our workforce, and we will root out misconduct wherever it occurs.
Okay, I look forward to continuing to work with you on this.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you for being here, and I hope you're recovering well from your bout with COVID.
Thank you, Senator.
I'm not going to get you into a question or get into a series of questions about whether or not you or the administration acknowledges that there's a crisis at the border. I'm going to give you my basis for why I believe there's a crisis. I think there's a crisis because hundreds of people have died, if not in this country, in transit to this country over the past years, not only this year, but in years past. Hundreds of bodies have been recovered on U.S. soil. I actually saw one in the Rio Grande when I was there just a few months ago. Billions of dollars are being paid to cartels in tolls to get across the border. And those who don't pay the toll and get caught trying to cross without it could end up dying. Tons of drugs are coming into this country. And we've seen that the latest report on seizures, they're going up. What worries me is how much we don't know, how much is coming in this country and poisoning Americans. Just anecdotally, what I consider to be a crisis is when an 11-year-old girl who was actually being treated at the time I was down at the border, 11-year-old girl couldn't speak. She had been gang raped, and it had gone over so long that she was screaming and crying. That's a crisis. And I don't think that that's unique. Another example. We can get into the anecdotal reports, but we do know that criminals are coming across the border. Some are being, and thank goodness for Border Patrol and ICE and others who are responsible for this, they are being apprehended. But they're the ones that they're similar to our seizure reports. We always end after we talk about a seizure of a significant amount of fentanyl or other drugs. It's a win, but we always know it's a minority. So for every one of these criminals that we're finding, the so-called runners now, or the gotaways,
for everyone we capture, I think it's fair to say that many more are coming into the country. So I do think it's a crisis, and I do agree that a part of it is a result of a failed immigration system. If I have time, I'm going to ask you a question a little bit about that. But I do believe it's a crisis, and I think if we sat down and talked about the fatalities, talked about the impending crisis when the vaccine mandate is imposed and we're already down on Border Patrol agents. How many Border Patrol agent positions are open right now?
Vacancies?
Yeah.
I don't have that number at my disposal, but I will say, Senator, that the rate of Border Patrol agents being vaccinated has increased significantly.
But even, I mean, you could argue, if I were gaming this out as a businessman, you could game it out, even if it's a 5 or 6 or 7% attrition rate at the end of the day. So you get 93%. Do you think it's a good thing, or could it present another employment crisis if you lose 6 or 7% of your workforce?
We don't want to lose anyone.
And knowing, as I do, the process for onboarding a Border Patrol agent, we don't have a big pipeline because it's a lengthy, arduous process that many of these people couldn't afford to wait for to actually get on board if they want to. And again, I want to thank all the Border Patrol agents because in some respects, they're getting the same wrath that many police officers have gotten. You got the actions based on whatever investigation occurs of maybe a bad actor, maybe not, maybe didn't understand the context they were operating in, and you're giving people even fewer reasons to want to come and work in one of the most difficult jobs in law enforcement right now, and that's down on the border. Those, to me, in their totality, to any rational person, would suggest to me we got a crisis that we need to work on. We can debate the efficacy of the prior administration's policies, the problems that I have with some of the current policies, but I do think we need to recognize there's a problem. Now, back in June, the press reported Vice President Harris, who I understand is leading the effort for the immigration challenge, or whatever they're referring to at the border, a sweeping strategy. And I think in roughly that same time, we had a document titled DHS Plan to Restore Trust in Our Legal Immigration System. I sent you a letter back in June. I think in September you told, the department responded, it's a blueprint, it's work in process, so you couldn't really share it with us now. But we heard media reports that had been shared. Question now is the blueprint finalized, and to what extent is it actually affecting your operation?
So if I may, Senator, and also thank you very much for recognizing the vulnerability of the individuals who regrettably placed their lives in the hands of exploitative smugglers. Indeed, the toll.
I did a back-of-the-napkin math, and the average toll right now is about $7,000 to $8,000. I discounted it to $5,000. If you multiply it by 1.7, that's about $8.5 billion. And I know the recidivism, maybe they got a money-back guarantee, so let's just, but that's why I discounted it to $5,000. We're paying cartels, human smugglers, people that run the plazas across the southern border on the other side of the river, billions of dollars. That alone would seem like a crisis to me. If we discounted everything else, I've got to get to one question, though. It has to do with vaccinations. I've read several reports about a relatively low receptivity rate for the vaccine. Now, we've got a president who's implementing a national mandate for vaccines for any employers over 100 employees and all federal employees. Why shouldn't we mandate that somebody who comes across the border illegally shouldn't be vaccinated, or that's a reason for expulsion under Title 42 or any other law?
Senator, the analysis for migrants encountered at the border is quite different than for the federal workforce that leads by example. We are, in fact, removing those individuals. We're expelling them very rapidly.
Can we remove them if they refuse to take a vaccine?
Under Title 42.
Why shouldn't that be, if we're talking about, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but he's being really good. Oh, he's gone, so I may have a shot. In deference to Senator Ossoff, I'll be brief. But look, if we think for the safety of the American people, if the president thinks that he should mandate a vaccine, it just seems absurd to me that that wouldn't be a deal killer for anybody coming through who's not willing to accept the vaccine. And in fact, by sending the message to anybody coming to our border that you're going to probably get removed, but you're going to get vaccinated or absolutely get removed, maybe that's one pull factor we can work on together right now. And finally, that, I know you said to Senator Graham that the 400,000-ish, let's say hundreds of thousands of dollars right now being negotiated in the DHS is out of your lanes. I agree. But I do believe it's wrong. And I do believe if they end up settling, and it becomes known that you can come across our border and potentially build a case to get hundreds of thousands of dollars of payout, it's going to be another reason why it's a crisis and not just a situation we're trying to work through. Thank you, and I wish you good health.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Secretary, I'm recognized and appreciate your testimony. Glad to see that you've recovered fully from COVID-19.
Thank you, Senator.
I want to thank you for the recent responsiveness to requests for information from the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. We face some challenges, and you and I have had some candid conversations about that. We've seen a marked improvement in the department's responses to the Permanent Subcommittee. Grateful for that, and want to ask you for your commitment that that will continue, and that as the Permanent Subcommittee for Investigations continues its work, that we'll continue to see that kind of robust and timely response to our requests.
You most certainly will, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'd like to discuss with you the supply chain bottlenecks, constraints we're facing at major shipping container ports across the country. As you know, state of Georgia hosts the Port of Savannah, which is, depending upon how you count, the third or fourth largest port of its kind in the United States. It hosts the largest single container terminal in the United States, and like ports across the country and indeed around the world, we're seeing significant delays in the processing of inbound shipments and challenges. Want to ask you what steps the department is taking as part of a broader federal response to ease these bottlenecks at shipping ports.
Senator, I'm very well aware of the challenge there. One measure that we have taken operationally is to increase the hours of operation, sometimes at a 24/7 clip, to facilitate easing the adverse consequences of the supply chain challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I was glad that the White House and the administration accepted my request that approximately $8 million be allocated to allow the Port of Savannah to rapidly scale up its operations, establish some auxiliary shipping container areas, make greater use of inland ports. I'm glad those resources are on the way, and I'd like to ask you for your commitment that the Department of Homeland Security, to the extent it's involved in those efforts, will move as rapidly as possible to support our efforts to expand capacity at the Port of Savannah.
We most certainly will, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. On a related note, in addition to hosting the fourth largest container port in the country, Georgia hosts the busiest airport in the world, as you know well, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. And given the changes to COVID-19 related restrictions on entry to the United States, for example, from European countries, and the significant increase in domestic travel, there are real concerns about CBP capacity and TSA capacity at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, airports across the country. And I've heard from Delta Airlines, heard from the City of Atlanta, concerns about the ability to process entrants, for example, from European countries, tourists and business people who we want to be here and doing commerce in the United States, but we need smooth operations at our airports. And so my question for you, Mr. Secretary, will you please designate someone in the department who can speak with major stakeholders like Delta Airlines, like the airport leadership, the City of Atlanta, just to make sure we're all on the same page about the airport's needs, the operators' needs, the carriers' needs, and to have an open line of communication about what else the department might be able to do to smooth operations and reduce traveler wait times, both domestic travel, encountering TSA lines, and international travelers at the airport.
Senator, most certainly, and I can identify those individuals right now.
Please.
Troy Miller is the acting commissioner of CBP, very experienced. He grew up in the organization in the Office of Field Operations, and William Ferrara, who now leads the Office of Field Operations for CBP. On the TSA side, I would recommend Administrator David Pekoske and Darby LaJoy. These are individuals who are expert and have been very focused on staffing of the airport in Atlanta, of course, and all airports, big and small, across the country.
Great. Well, look forward to convening those two public servants with airport leadership, city leadership, Delta and other carriers, and making sure that we're all communicating well about not just meeting but anticipating the airport's needs as travel continues to increase nationwide.
Senator, I would be pleased to engage as well. This is something that we're very focused on. This goes to the prosperity of our country in receiving people for tourism and business purposes and other reasons.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I look forward to working with you on that. My final question for you about U.S. Coast Guard. Had the pleasure of meeting with the 7th District Command, as well as meeting with enlisted personnel, enlisted U.S. Coast Guard personnel, and hearing from them their needs, their concerns. I have such immense respect for the extraordinary men and women of the United States Coast Guard, as I know you do, for the work they do every day to protect the country, to prevent illegal fishing, to enforce our immigration laws, to respond to natural disasters, provide search and rescue services to Americans who need help. They are amazing people, and I commend the U.S. Coast Guard for the extraordinary work they do. I have heard from, especially enlisted Coast Guard personnel, about the difficulties that they're having with affordable housing and child care. And so what I want to ask you is that someone from your team will work with mine to map out whether there are some solutions that we can find working together to ensure that Coast Guard personnel, and especially those younger junior enlisted personnel, have access to affordable housing and to child care services. There's a discussion we can perhaps have about the base housing allowance. I know that gets into some complex issues involving the Department of Defense as well. So I'm not asking you for a specific policy commitment, but your engagement and your staff's engagement in working together to address some of these quality of life and kitchen table, pocketbook issues for especially those young women and men who are keeping our country safe through their service in the Coast Guard.
Thank you so much, Senator Ossoff, and let me share with you that pursuant to the bill that President Biden signed into law yesterday, $434 million, I think is the figure, will be dedicated to the United States Coast Guard, and part of that money will be to address some of the quality of life issues to which you now refer, housing, child care, and the like. That is just one example why the bill that the President signed into law, and it's a bipartisan bill that the President championed, and so many others, is such a monumental chapter in our American history.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I agree with you completely. And, you know, despite the partisanship of many of these hearings, I want to again point out that that infrastructure bill, which will support airports and ports and our Coast Guard, was bipartisan, showing that the political parties can rise above partisanship and put the national interest first. Thank you, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Senator.
We will now take a short 10-minute recess to allow senators to vote. When we return, Senator Cotton will be recognized for his first round of questioning. Any senators requesting a second round may ask their questions following Senator Cotton.
Mr. Secretary, I understand we're in recess now for a few minutes, so stand at ease.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you.
Sarah, I'm ready to start. We've got a cotton here.
So Cotton will be recognized for his first round, and then after that, we would immediately go into the second round for anyone who's here.
Senator Cotton is going to be recognized for his first round. And I might say that any senator seeking a second round needs to be physically present, as Senator Lee is, to make that request. And so each of the staff members have 10 minutes to make sure that your member, if interested in the second round, is physically here. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, on September 29th, the National School Board Association wrote to the White House calling parents domestic terrorists for being concerned about their kids' school. Within a few days, Attorney General Garland issued a directive to the Department of Justice and the FBI to crack down not just on violent, but what he called, quote, harassment and intimidation against school board administrators, board members, teachers, and staff. The School Board Association met with the White House and got tips from them on what to put in their letter before sending it. We've also recently learned from an internal memorandum that the School Board Association, quote, as disruptions at school board meetings grow, the association has been actively engaged with the Department of Homeland Security. Has anyone from the Department of Homeland Security met with anyone from the National School Board Association?
Senator, not that I'm familiar with, and I don't know why that would fall within our jurisdiction.
Did you see a copy of the Attorney General's memorandum before it was released?
I did not.
Okay, thank you. A few weeks ago, it was reported that the Department of Justice was in talks to give payments of up to $450,000 per person to illegal immigrants who were subject to enforcement of the zero tolerance policy during the last administration. Have you or anyone at the Department of Homeland Security been involved in those talks?
I have not, and I am not aware of anyone in the department who's been involved in the talks. That is something within the province of the Department of Justice.
So let me ask you this, and let me be explicit. I'm not talking about the lawsuits that are filed or the Department of Justice's litigation strategy or potential settlements. Who do you think is more deserving of cash payments from the United States government? Illegal migrants who cross our borders or the family of U.S. soldiers who are killed in action?
Senator, I think, if I may, you know how I'll answer that question. I think that the families of those who lost their lives wearing our nation's uniform are our greatest responsibility as a nation.
So do you?
I can't.
Do you think it's shocking that illegal migrants could get up to 4.5 times what the family
Senator
of a service member killed in action?
Senator, if I may, I'm a lawyer by profession, so I don't think it advisable to render opinions on facts, on cases, the facts and circumstances of which I am not familiar, because I know that the cases that are before the Department of Justice to which you are referring are Federal Tort Claims Act, where not all of those unlawfully present are filing suit against the government, but those parents whose children were taken from them as a means of deterring irregular migration, part of the zero tolerance policy of the prior administration, the family separation policy that received bipartisan condemnation and, quite frankly, the condemnation of the American public. What is an appropriate outcome of that litigation in response to the family separation policy, the cruel policy, is something I cannot opine on.
Well, since you called the policy cruel, let me ask you this. During the Biden administration, has the Department of Homeland Security ever separated a single illegal alien from someone they claim as their child?
Yes, but not as part of the zero tolerance policy, not as part of the family separation policy that was so cruel. Let me explain.
So, I understand that you're saying it's not part of the policy.
I'm sorry.
No.
If I may, Senator,
No,
I must
actually, no,
clarify.
you may not. It's my time. I'm sorry, my time is limited. So you've said that the Department of Homeland Security has done this during the Biden administration. You were the deputy secretary during the Obama administration. Did the Department of Homeland Security ever separate a single illegal alien from someone they claimed that was their child in the Obama administration?
Neither in the Biden administration nor in the Obama administration that we execute the zero-tolerance policy that the Trump administration promulgated and cruelly enforced.
I'd say the policies you've been implementing are complete tolerance for illegal migrants crossing our border. Let's turn our attention there. How many illegal aliens crossed into the country, into the United States in 2020?
I don't have the,
I have the numbers from CBP in front of me. It's 458,000. How many illegal aliens have crossed into the United States in 2021, which I would note still has 6 weeks to go?
I believe the number, taking out of that approximately 1.7 million, the number of recidivists, so in other words, unique individuals, approximately 1.3, 1.4 million.
Okay.
Would be my estimate.
So I have 1.7, but that's fine. So it's somewhere between 2.5 to 4 times as much.
No, because the 1.7 million figure to which you refer, Senator, includes recidivists.
Okay, so let's say it's 1.3. It's still 2.5 times. Are you satisfied that 2.5 times as many illegal migrants have crossed in this country this year as compared to last year?
No, I'm not, but worse is to promulgate and operationalize a policy that defies our values as a nation.
How about that defies our sovereignty as a nation?
Oh, our sovereignty is unflinching.
Oh, really? Because as it stands now at the border, anyone from anywhere in the world can simply show up and cross into this country.
I don't think that the hundreds of thousands of individuals who've been expelled under Title 42, the CDC's authority, would actually...
Well, the 1.7 million who've crossed here probably think so. Let me conclude with this. What should be a higher priority of the United States government, securing our border or giving amnesty to illegal aliens who are already here?
Senator, justice is our priority. That includes securing our border and providing relief to those who qualify for it under our laws.
So you refuse to prioritize whether we should try to protect our border from people crossing it who have zero right to be here, or giving amnesty to the millions of people that are in this country illegally?
Senator, I disagree wholeheartedly with the phrasing of your question. It is an inaccurate phrasing of our missions, our responsibilities, our challenges, and our actions.
How is it inaccurate? I mean, we have had 1.3 million by your own admission cross just this year. There are millions more in this country who are here illegally. I'm simply asking you, what is more important? What's a higher priority of the United States government, to protect our border or to give amnesty to those who are here illegally?
Senator, we do not have the authority nor the intention to give amnesty.
You testified that you wanted it, though, in your opening statement.
No,
a pathway to citizenship, legal status, whatever you want to call it, any kind of adjustment. What's more important, securing our border or giving some kind of adjustment to the legal status of those illegal aliens present in the country today?
Senator, I consider those to be both very significant priorities because they are inextricably intertwined. If, in fact, we can pass legislation that fixes once and for all our immigration system, we will have addressed in a material part the challenges at our border, and it will advance our efforts to secure it.
Well, they're intertwined chiefly because the open borders that you and Joe Biden have permitted have attracted even more illegal immigrants here. That means our borders are more open than it ever has been.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Lee, we're on the second round of questions, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, on some of these questions, including the questions many of my colleagues have asked about the proposed settlement with those who have crossed through our borders unlawfully, you've indicated you're inclined to dodge the question. I don't expect that to change between now and the end of this hearing, but I do want to communicate to you some of the things that I've been hearing all over the place from people across the political spectrum throughout the state of Utah. A lot of them really don't like that. They don't appreciate it. You know, the average family of 4 in Utah has a total household income of $71,000. If you got a family of 4 that crossed through our borders unlawfully and was subject to this settlement agreement, you'd be looking at $1.8 million in a settlement. You know, it would take 2.5 decades for the average family of 4 in Utah to earn that. So the thought that the federal government is offering that as a reward, as an incentive for people who cross through our borders unlawfully is unthinkable to many Utahns, as well it should be. People of Utah and people of the United States certainly deserve better than that. The fact that this was even seriously considered is troubling to me. I don't know why we want to do that, and I certainly don't believe that one can deny the impact that this would have as a magnet for future illegal immigration. Now, about 60% of those here unlawfully are visa overstays, people who came here lawfully and then fell out of their lawful status. Wish we had more time, and I could ask you, what you're doing to apprehend those people. I wish I could ask you further things like what additional resources you might need, because it'd be good to know what we could do for you to be able to gain operational control of the border again, which the American people want and expect and need and deserve. Look, the Department of Homeland Security has clearly failed in its mission to maintain operational control of its borders. The department itself acknowledges how important it is. Over 2 million people have likely crossed over our southern border illegally this year with no end in sight. You've seen no concrete plan for stopping these border surges. Instead, your department's focused on climate change. These facts seem to indicate, Mr. Secretary, that Americans cannot hope to keep fentanyl out of their communities, that terrorists and gang members can't be kept out of their neighborhoods, and criminal aliens off their streets, as long as you're in charge of the Department of Homeland Security and running it the way that you've been running it. This cannot continue. For the safety of the American people, including people like the woman who was recently raped in open sight in a Philadelphia subway train just recently by someone who shouldn't have been here in the first place, who had a criminal alien background. I implore you, you got to fix this. Fix it or step down. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Graham.
Thank you. So let's get the numbers right. I want to work with you where I can, but I want the American people to understand of the 1.7 million that came across illegally that we've apprehended, what happened to them? Okay, you said previously 965,000 were subject to Title 42 expulsion. Is that basically correct?
Yes, Senator.
How many were expelled?
No, I believe that number represents, my information is that number represents the
All of them?
Yes. The number of
Okay, well,
individuals.
we'll check it, but let's just, all of them. You said that 40,000 were removed under Title 8. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
Taken out of the country. 125,000 were sent over to HHS. How many of them left the country?
that number I don't have.
I can tell you, all of them are still here. We called HHS. None of them have left the country of any substance. So that's 125,000, pretty much. You said 375,000 were released into the United States. That's what you said before. Is that accurate?
Senator, can you repeat the number, because I know that
Here's what you're, and this is why I'm doing it. You said previously 375,000 of the 1.7 were released in the United States. Is that still accurate?
approximately.
Okay, and we're not, just be approximate here. So I want people to know the 125,000 unaccompanied minors, they went from one government agency to the other, but they're still here, and they're never going to leave. The 375,000 were released into the United States. So that's 500,000 of the 1.7 still here.
Those, and if I may, those individuals, the 375 approximately,
Right.
are in immigration enforcement proceedings.
Right, and we know that there's over 1 million people had a final order of deportation that are still here. But the point is, of the 1.7 million that came here, 500,000 are still here, and there's a 230,000 gap. What happened to the 230,000?
Well, if I may, Senator, and I think it's very important to
Okay.
know that of the 1.7 million, that is not 1.7 million different individuals.
Okay?
Because there is a rate of recidivism.
Well, are these people, did they come across in the time period in question? I don't care if they've come before. Did they come again?
They were encountered
Well, it doesn't matter if this is their third time. Did they come?
Yes, but
Okay, so
many
the
of them
point is,
fell.
1.7 million people came. Some of them were recidivists. The point is, if you look at this chart very quickly, Mr. Chairman, about half the people that came are still here, 40%, and that's unacceptable. And people know throughout the world that if you come here, you got a 1 in 3 chance of never leaving. That's got to change. I want to work with you to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Graham. I believe that Senator Cruz is next.
Thank you, Mr.
I forgot to look to my left, which is rare. Senator Blumenthal comes before you.
Feel free to continue not looking to your left.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I was asking you a little while ago about the precise numbers of resources and the timeline, and the reason that I'm very intent on resettling and the numbers and the timeline is I don't want to be back here in 6 months from now and for you to say, if only we had the resources. I would like you to tell me what the resources are now so that we can hold ourselves accountable if we fail to provide them. And we have an obligation to provide them so that the Afghan refugees who come here, they are allies and partners who have been at our side in Afghanistan, who put their lives on the line, they've risked their families, and they are coming here because they have targets on their backs there, and we have an obligation. It's a moral imperative. I want to salute all the veterans groups and everyone involved in the effort. My office has been a part of a coalition that has enabled flights to leave, but as to everyone who's coming to this country, we have an obligation to make sure they have jobs and housing and health care. I know you share that view. You've also been asked this morning about the so-called separation policy, family separation policy, which resulted from children being torn from their parents. And I know you have some firsthand experience with some of these families. Could you tell us a little bit about the harm that results from families being torn apart in this way and why the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics called Trump's policy, quote, government-sanctioned child abuse? Well, thank you, Senator. And let me make it perfectly clear that neither the Obama administration or the Biden administration executed the zero-tolerance policy of separating children from their parents to deter irregular migration. In direct response to your question, what comes immediately to mind is my conversation with a mother who was, in fact, through our work, reunited with her teenage daughter. But she said that the emotional and psychological separation continues, that the daughter at a young age did not understand why her mother could not protect her from the cruelty of the prior administration, and there remains a distance between them that both the mother and the daughter continue to suffer. And that is why I say that the cruelty is tragically a lasting one, and we're doing what we can to address it. And you and I, as lawyers, and others, as a matter of fact, members of this committee who have been attorneys general of their state, as I have been, or United States attorney, or as I have been also, an assistant United States attorney, know that sometimes governments are sued, state and federal governments, and settlements are in the best interests of those governments because a trial could result in even greater liability than a settlement could. Am I correct in that view? You are, Senator, and I think the American public was united in its condemnation of the family separation policy of this prior administration, and it is that public that will constitute a jury in any trial.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, you told Senator Graham that you've released somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 illegal aliens. You told me you don't know how many of those had COVID. You told me further you don't know how many of those were sexually assaulted by the human traffickers who brought them in. When you were talking with Chairman Durbin, you talked about catch and release. And Chairman Durbin asked you whether illegal immigrants who are released under catch and release and given a court date in the future, whether they show up. And you responded, quote, "The great majority do, Mr. Chairman." Secretary Mayorkas, I believe that testimony is false. It is contrary to virtually every public reporting on the matter. For example, I'm looking at a July 27, 2021 story in Axios that describes just 13% of migrants had shown up after catch and release. You know you're under oath and subject to the penalty of perjury. Do you stand by your testimony to this committee that the great majority of illegal aliens released under catch and release show up voluntarily at court proceedings?
Can I give you the data that I have at my disposal,
Sure.
Senator? The percentage of non-citizens who have checked in, who have been compliant with the alternatives to detention, or are within their reporting time frame,
That's not the question. How many show up at the court
is
hearing?
65%.
You're giving stats that aren't answering the question. How many show up at the court hearing? The stat that from Axios showed 13%. You're claiming 13% is the great majority.
Well, I'm pulling from the data that I have, Senator, and I will verify the accuracy of the data after my testimony today and report back to you. Because
So if your testimony that the great majority show up for hearing is wrong and false testimony, you will correct it in writing. Let me ask you subsequently.
let me.
You won't correct it in writing?
No, I most certainly will, but I need to say something, Senator. And that is that I take my oath.
Fine, you take your oath seriously. My time is limited on that. Let me ask you another question. It's been reported the Biden administration is considering paying illegal immigrants whose families were separated $450,000 apiece. That would mean for a family of four, they would get $1.8 million.
That's not my understanding.
What is your understanding?
My understanding, and it's drawn from news reports because this is not something that the Department of Homeland Security...
You're the defendant in the lawsuits.
Is that it is that amount of money per family, but I may be mistaken.
That is not what has been publicly reported. It is per person. Do you think it is a good idea to pay illegal immigrants 4.5 times what we pay the family of a service member who's killed in combat? And if we pay millions of dollars to illegal immigrants, in your professional judgment, will we get more illegal immigration or less illegal immigration?
Senator, let me say this, that I do not think a mother would travel to the United States in the hands of traffickers so that she can be separated from her 7-year-old daughter for a period of time, the duration of which she has
Can you
no
answer the
idea.
question? Those were two yes and no questions.
I do not think that it would be a pull factor.
I said, is it a good idea to pay them the money, and would you get more illegal immigration or less illegal immigration if you give millions of dollars to illegal immigrants?
I cannot...
More or less?
I cannot speak to the advisability of settling Federal Tort Claims Act in which I am not involved.
But you have no view on whether
Thank
paying
you,
illegal
Senator
immigrants
Cruz.
millions of dollars creates more illegal immigration?
Thank you, Senator Cruz.
Well, can he answer the question?
You asked that question 2 or 3 times.
And he's refused to answer it 2 or 3
And your
times.
time has expired. You've gone longer than
So the
any other.
Secretary of DHS has no idea whether paying illegal
Senator,
immigrants
it has-
millions of dollars produces more
It has
illegal
nothing
immigration.
to do with the substance of the question, but the fact.
Are you going to give him an
once-
opportunity to
Once
answer it?
again, you've gone longer than any other senator. Senator Padilla?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mayorkas, we have a couple of additional questions. I know in the first round of questioning, actually had a couple areas that we were complimenting your leadership and the department on, and I want to share with the committee another positive announcement that you made back in July. I was pleased to hear at the time that you and Secretary McDonough were starting a new initiative to bring back non-citizen military service members and veterans and their families who had been removed from the United States. This past June, I held a meeting of my subcommittee on this issue, and just this week introduced the Veteran Deportation Prevention and Reform Act. This bill would put processes in place to reduce the removal of veterans who bravely fought for our country and yet missed the opportunity to become United States citizens while serving in the military. So I want to thank you for your partnership on that and for working with me on another specific case. Mr. Howard Bailey, a Navy veteran who is now back home in the United States with his family after nearly a decade. He had been deported for an old charge that had since been pardoned. But I am curious to know what steps the department has taken since the announcement made back in July. Can you share any updates on the work of the initiative and what progress has been made to bring our deported veterans home, and if there's specific plans that the department has to improve the naturalization rates of non-citizen military service members while they are serving?
Senator, thank you so much for your dedication to this issue. We indeed have a concerted effort to bring back veterans who are unjustly deported, and we have a concerted effort to ensure that veterans are aware of the immigration benefits to which they might be entitled and could avail themselves of those benefits. We have indeed, I believe, brought back 5 veterans under this program. We have published education materials to the veteran community and the broader public to advise the veteran community of the immigration benefits to which they might be entitled. And this effort is under the leadership of Deborah Rogers, who has dedicated her career to this effort, and I would welcome the opportunity to keep your office informed of our progress.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I certainly look forward to working with you to improve the naturalization rates of individuals who enlist with that aspiration, in some cases expectation, and restoring the process that facilitates, not obstructs, their ability to become citizens. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, just a few additional questions. I just want to clarify something you just testified to Senator Cruz. I think you just said that your view is that paying illegal immigrants $450,000 or more, $1 million more per family, $1.8 million, that is not a pull factor. In other words, it wouldn't encourage more illegal immigration, right? You said not a pull factor, your words.
May I have the opportunity to answer this question?
Well, I just want to be, you said not a pull factor, right? I couldn't quite hear you at the time, so I just want to be sure that's what you said.
The settlement payment of the federal tort claim charge arising from a family separation effected under the prior administration's zero tolerance policy would not be a pull factor. That is my testimony.
That is your, understood. I think that's news, that you think that these payments to illegal immigrants would not be a pull factor, that paying them would not encourage more illegal immigration. That's news. Thank you for that. I want to ask you about something else that's been in the news. Back in March, when the president said that Vice President Harris would be his border czar, he said she's the most qualified person to help in stemming the movement of so many folks, stemming the migration to our southern border. That's President Biden. Do you report to her?
Senator, I report to the Vice President and the President, and your question misstates the facts. The President did not appoint the Vice President to be the border czar. He asked her to lead the effort in addressing the root causes of irregular migration. Those are two very different things.
I see. So is she working closely with you on that important endeavor? How often do you meet with her?
I am certainly in close touch with the Vice President.
How often do you meet on this subject?
I've met with the Vice President more than a handful of times.
But more than a handful? Well, So what's that mean?
I'm-
6 or 7 times in the last year?
Oh, no. First of all, I have not been in office for a year, Senator. Secondly, I am in close touch.
So she's very involved in the department's policies and in what's happening at the southern border. You've traveled to the border together?
Senator, allow me to repeat my testimony that the Vice President's focus is on addressing the root cause.
I heard your testimony. I'm asking you a question. My question is, do you travel to the border together? Are you devising policies together?
I have traveled to the border once with the Vice President to El Paso, Texas, so that she could see firsthand the challenges that we face.
And has she been part of your policies, to your decision to end the Remain in Mexico policy, to end the public charge rule, to change the ICE guidance? Has she been part of those decisions?
I have not consulted with the Vice President directly about those policies.
So what is she doing exactly? You said she's not the border czar, that's not her role. We were wrong about that. She's not doing anything like that. She's doing something very different, is what your testimony is, but you're not actually consulting with her on any policy. So what is it that she's doing exactly?
Senator, as I have repeatedly testified, she is focused on addressing the root causes of irregular migration in the context of the migration challenge.
How's that been going?
That is we are advancing considerably, and in fact, I am contributing to that effort.
You think the policies are working?
I have met with the leadership in Mexico, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Honduras, and other countries to address.
And those efforts are working? That's been successful?
Oh, this is a
Time's
process
expired.
That takes time and delivers an enduring solution.
Senator Grassley?
Mr. Secretary, what specific criminal conduct would cause an Afghan evacuee parole to be terminated?
Senator, it is conduct in violation of parole will require us to conduct an individualized examination, understand the facts and circumstances of the violation, and
can you name
we will revoke parole.
I'm after the type of criminal activity that would cause the parole to be terminated. Just give me a couple, 3 examples.
It could be anything. It could be.
Okay, then let me go to the next question then. What's the status of an Afghan national housed at Fort Bliss who were involved in an alleged attack on a female service member on September the 19th? Has that parole been terminated?
Senator, I am not familiar with the case of which you speak. I do know that an individual who sexually assaulted another individual on a base is being criminally prosecuted, and immigration detainer has been posted as well, so that immigration enforcement proceedings, removal proceedings, can follow the consequences of the criminal prosecution.
So they will be removed then?
I don't know specifically the name of the individual of which you speak, but if we have the same case in mind, the answer is affirmative.
Okay. Now, another case, and this could be the one you're referring to as well. I don't know which one you might have in mind, but what's the current status of an Afghan national housed at Fort McCoy who was recently indicted for assaulting his wife? Has his parole been terminated, and if so, when would they be removed?
Senator, I don't know the name of the individual, the case to which you refer. It's hard for me to answer based on a generic description of the case, but I will say this. An individual who is charged criminally, an immigration detainer will be placed on that individual. Pending the outcome of the criminal charges, we will determine whether the immigration enforcement proceeding will in fact be pursued, removal will be effected, and of course, parole terminated.
Okay, last question. Then another case like that. What's the current status of an Afghan national flown out of Kabul and transferred to the United States on August 26th, who was convicted of felony rape in Idaho in 2010? So that's already a conviction. when will that person be removed and to what country will they be removed?
So, Senator, once again, I would need further identifiers with respect to that case, and I would be surprised if we discovered a prior conviction that parole was not already terminated, and I would be pleased to follow up with your office on the facts of that case.
Then on those 3 specific cases, or maybe it's 4, I will make sure that you get a written request and answer those specific cases, because if these people are criminally charged, we want them removed.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Blackburn.
Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for allowing us a second round. During the first round, for the record, I just want to say this. You wanted to challenge the stats that I was using, but the stats we're using are government stats, and they are accurate. But your attitude during that response was duly noted. I want to go to part of the response you gave to Chairman Durbin when you talked about technology. I have talked with local law enforcement and Border Patrol on the border, and yes, they all say they have needed the wall. They need technology where the wall cannot go. They need more agents and judges. But they have told me repeatedly that you all are removing technology from the border. So I would like to know if that is accurate or inaccurate, and if you want to come back to me with a response in writing, that would be helpful, because technology is something they need for surveillance.
Senator, I'd be very pleased to follow up with you, because I'm not aware of the removal of technology. And let me also, if I may, because you referenced my attitude, and I hope I was unflinchingly respectful in response to your questions,
Well,
and I apologize if you took it otherwise. I certainly did not mean to be.
Let me return to a question. Senator Graham has asked you, and I notified your staff that I was going to ask you this question. The total number of illegal immigrants in this country with an NTA or an NTR, and we would like to have that total number. And today you've been unable to provide that number.
I have that number, if I may.
Okay, that'd be wonderful.
Senator, between January 1st and October 31st of 2021, my data indicates that 210,465 non-citizens were issued notices to appear, and 94,581 were issued notices to report. We've discontinued the practice of issuing notices to report.
Okay, so we still have a lot of people that we do not know where they are in this country. If those are your numbers for what you have issued as NTAs and NTRs, but you also say there are 1.7 million people that have entered. In talking to Border Patrol, they think the gotaways number is high as 1.5 million. So, you know, it leads me to this number that you all say is in the country, where you continue to use the 11 million number, and I know Yale and other universities in their studies have challenged that number. You, as head of DHS, should have a more appropriate number for us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Mr. Secretary, I don't see anyone else seeking a second round, so I'm going to wrap it up with my own round and try to make it as brief as I can, but to try to clarify 2 or 3 issues that have been raised. First, the question of civil compensation under the Federal Tort Claim Act to parents whose children were removed from them forcibly, some of whom have never been reunited, strikes me as a former plaintiff's attorney as a pretty solid lawsuit. And to characterize these people as illegal aliens is wrong. At the time that those people present themselves at the border, they are not in an illegal situation whatsoever. They are asking for asylum. And separation that took place at that point would not be from an illegal alien parent, as I understand it. Secondly, to suggest that this is a pull factor, some civil settlement for taking your child away from you, perhaps never to be reunited, how many people will head to the United States border to take advantage of that bargain, to give up your child or to be separated from them forcibly. I think that's a ridiculous conclusion. Second, I understand one of the senators keeps talking about cages. If I recall correctly, during the Trump administration, many of these children were not given the benefit of even a roof over their heads in America. They were sent back for remain in Mexico, a policy which this administration does not support. I don't think they're going back into the loving arms of a day camp situation, but rather in many instances were exploited, in danger, and in the remain in Mexico situation, which is why we have not embraced it. Finally, let me suggest that your staff take a look at the findings of the study by the American Immigration Council released in January of 2021, which found as follows. A survey of nearly 3 million immigration court hearings spanning more than a decade found that 83% of all non-detained immigrants attended every single one of their court hearings, 83%. 15% of those immigrants who did miss a court hearing and were ordered deported were later able to successfully reopen their case and have their removal orders rescinded. Catch and release, 83%, 98%. And if they had a lawyer representing them, it was a 96% appearance. Catch and release? That just doesn't square with this notion. And I hope you'll take a look at it and critique it for me if you think it is a credible study. It sounds like as much to me. Would you like to comment on any of those observations?
I affirm the statements you've just articulated, Mr. Chairman, especially vigorously with respect to the Federal Tort Claims Act and what parents endured in being ripped apart from their children, some of whom have yet to see their children again.
God forbid these 1,800 kids who are still separated, that their parents are trying to ask for some compensation from that horrible thing that happened to them. That is hardly a pull factor in any circumstance. I thank you for your patience. I know this was a trial, and you've weathered it well from my perspective. There may be some follow-up questions for the record, which I hope you'll respond to in a timely fashion. And with that, the Senate Judiciary Committee stands adjourned.